If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Marcus Daniels. I'm 38 years old, and I've been a park ranger here in Denali National Park for the past year. Before that, I was an Army Ranger, served in Korea, and saw things that still haunt me to this day. I came here to escape, to leave behind the memories of war, a broken marriage, and the bottle that nearly ruined me. I thought the cold would help me forget. Turns out, it has a way of reminding you of everything you wish you could bury. It was the winter of 1959. One of the coldest on record. Temperatures dropped so low it felt like the air itself wanted to kill you. The snow didn't just cover the ground, it swallowed it whole, burying everything in a blanket of white silence. The kind of silence that makes you feel like you're the only living thing left in the world. I was sent out to check on a research station deep in the backcountry. They'd been studying glacial retreat and hadn't radioed in for days. Maybe their equipment froze over, maybe they were too busy with their work. Either way, it was my job to find out. I packed my gear, strapped on my snowshoes, and headed out into the wilderness. The trek was brutal. The wind cut through every layer of clothing like it wasn't even there, and the snow seemed to pull at my legs with every step. By the time I reached the station, my face felt like it had been carved out of ice. The place looked normal enough from a distance, lights off but standing strong against the elements. When I stepped inside, though, something felt wrong immediately. The air was colder than it should have been, even with the heaters running full. Blast! My breath hung in front of me like smoke from a dying fire refusing to disappear. The walls were lined with frost patterns that looked almost deliberate, like someone had carved them there with precision. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty halls. No answer. I started checking rooms one by one. Beds were unmade but empty. Equipment was scattered across desks as if someone had been working just hours ago. There was no sign of struggle, no blood or overturned furniture, but something about it felt abandoned in a way that didn't make sense. In one corner of the lab, I found a journal belonging to one of the researchers, a Dr. Eleanor Reed. The last few entries were frantic, barely legible. She wrote about strange ice formations near the glacier they were studying, formations that seemed to grow overnight without explanation. She mentioned hearing sounds coming from deep within the ice, low whispers that made her skin crawl. I flipped through more pages until one word stopped me cold. Moving. She'd written it over and over again. Something is moving within the glacier. I didn't know what to make of it at first. It sounded like paranoia or exhaustion, but then I found something else. In one of the storage rooms near the back of the station were animal carcasses, foxes and birds mostly, all frozen solid but perfectly preserved. They weren't lying naturally. They were posed as if frozen mid-movement. A fox stood upright on its hind legs, mouth open in a silent scream. A raven perched on a shelf with its wings spread wide as though ready to take flight. He reached out to touch one of them, the fox, and recoiled immediately. Its fur wasn't just cold, it felt sharp, like tiny shards of glass were embedded in its skin. That's when I noticed something else, tiny blue crystals growing out from its eyes. I backed away quickly, my heart pounding harder than it had during any firefight in Korea. Something was wrong here. Something beyond anything I'd ever dealt with before. I decided to check their radio equipment next, hoping I could call for backup or at least report what I'd found. But when I reached for the transmitter, it shattered in my hands like brittle ice. The temperature started dropping even further as night fell outside. I could feel it creeping into my bones despite every layer I wore. It wasn't natural. It wasn't right. And then came the sound, the faintest whisper carried by the wind outside. It wasn't human. The whispering sound outside didn't stop. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, like the wind was carrying a voice that didn't belong to it. I stood there in the middle of the station, frozen in place, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew better. I grabbed my flashlight and decided to check the rest of the building. Maybe someone was still here. Maybe they were hiding. The thought gave me just enough courage to move. The beam of light cut through the darkness as I walked down the narrow hallway, my boots crunching softly on the frost-covered floor. The first thing I found was a trail of icy footprints leading toward one of the back rooms. They weren't mine. They were too small, like they belonged to a woman or a teenager. My stomach tightened as I followed them, my breath fogging up in front of me with every step. The footprints stopped at a door that was slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly, and that's when I saw him. It was one of the researchers, a man in his 30s, maybe 40s, standing in the middle of the room. At first, I thought he was alive because he was upright, but then I noticed his skin. It was pale blue, almost translucent, and his eyes, they were wide open but completely frozen over, like two marbles made of ice. His mouth was twisted into an expression of pure terror. I stepped closer and waved my hand in front of his face. Nothing. He didn't move an inch. That's when I realized he wasn't standing on his own. His feet were fused to the floor by thick ice that had grown up around them. I stumbled back, my heart racing. What could do something like this? A person couldn't freeze solid like that. Not this fast, not in these conditions. Then I noticed something else. Tiny blue crystals growing out from his eyes, just like on the fox I'd seen earlier. I turned and ran back down the hallway toward the main room where I'd left my pack. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my radio again, hoping maybe it wasn't completely broken. But as soon as I touched it, frost spread across its surface like wildfire, and it shattered into pieces right in front of me. The whispering outside grew louder. I don't know why, maybe it was instinct, but I grabbed my father's old hunting knife from my belt and held it tight. It wasn't much against whatever was happening here, but it made me feel less helpless. Then I heard a sound behind me, a soft, cracking noise like ice breaking under pressure. I spun around and saw another body near one of the windows. This one was a woman, another researcher, but she wasn't lying down or slumped over like you'd expect from someone who'd frozen to death. She was standing perfectly upright with her arms stretched out in front of her like she'd been trying to push something away. Her face will haunt me forever. Her eyes were wide open too, but they weren't just frozen. They looked hollow, like someone had scooped out her soul and left nothing behind. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, and frost had grown over her teeth and lips in jagged patterns. The window behind her had strange shapes etched into its surface, patterns that looked almost like symbols or writing, but they weren't anything I recognized. I backed away slowly, keeping my knife raised even though I knew it wouldn't do much good against whatever had done this. My breath came out in short bursts now, fogging up so thickly it felt like I could barely see through it. And then, silence. The whispering stopped all at once, leaving only the sound of my own breathing echoing through the empty station. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over, that whatever had caused this had left. But then the temperature dropped again, so fast it made my ears pop, and frost began creeping up the walls right before my eyes. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. Whatever had killed those people, whatever had frozen them solid, it wasn't done yet. I grabbed what little gear I could carry and headed for the door. But when I stepped outside into the freezing night air, I realized just how bad things really were. The snow around the station wasn't normal anymore. It glittered under the moonlight like shards of broken glass. And in the distance, near the edge of the tree line, something moved. It wasn't human. I froze in place, staring at the tree line. Something was there. Something tall and thin, barely visible in the moonlight. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the shadows or my tired eyes playing games with me. But then it moved again, slow and deliberate, like it was watching me. I gripped my knife tighter, my heart pounding in my chest. The thing didn't come closer. It just stood there, blending into the snow and trees like it was part of the landscape. Its skin, or whatever it had, looked translucent, almost like ice itself. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and heavy. I backed toward the door of the station, keeping my eyes on it the whole time. My boots crunched loudly in the snow, and that sound felt deafening in the silence of the night. When I reached the door, I slipped back inside and locked it behind me, even though I knew a lock wouldn't stop something like that. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath and figure out what to do next. That's when I heard movement. From deeper inside the station. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. For a moment, there was no answer. Then I heard a faint whisper, this time not from outside but from inside one of the supply closets. It wasn't just a whisper. It sounded like someone crying softly. I moved toward the sound slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. When I opened the closet door, I found her, Dr. Eleanor Reed, the woman whose journal I'd read earlier. She was curled up in the corner, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "Are you okay?" I asked, crouching down beside her. She shook her head quickly and grabbed my arm with trembling hands. "It's out there," she whispered. "It's watching us?" "What is?" I asked, even though I already knew she meant whatever I'd seen outside. She didn't answer right away. Her breathing was shallow and she kept glancing over her shoulder like she expected something to burst through the wall at any moment. "It's not human," she finally said. "It came from the glacier." I helped her to her feet and led her back to the main room where we could talk more safely, or at least as safely as possible given what was happening. She told me everything as we sat, huddled near one of the heaters that still worked. The research team had been drilling ice cores near a glacier that hadn't been touched for thousands of years. They'd found strange formations buried deep beneath the surface, things that looked like frozen bodies but weren't human. Then they started hearing sounds, whispers coming from inside the ice, and seeing movement out of the corners of their eyes. At first, they thought it was just exhaustion or paranoia from being isolated for so long. But then people started disappearing and coming back frozen solid. "We disturbed something," Dr. Reed said quietly. "Something ancient." Her words sent chills down my spine. Not just because of what she said, but because deep down, I believed her. "We need to get out of here," I said firmly. She nodded, but didn't look hopeful. "The emergency vehicle. It's encased in ice," she said. "We tried to reach it before, but it's like the ice is alive." I didn't want to believe her, but after everything I'd seen so far, how could I argue? Still, we couldn't stay here, not with that thing outside, and we couldn't wait for help that wasn't coming. "We'll find another way," I said, trying to sound confident even though fear was eating away at me. That night was one of the longest of my life. We barricaded ourselves in one of the rooms with a heater and waited for morning, or at least for something to change. Every few minutes we heard faint cracking sounds outside or saw frost creeping across the windows in strange patterns that looked almost like faces staring back at us. At one point, Dr. Reed whispered something that made my blood run cold. "It doesn't just kill you. It turns you into one of them." I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't want to know. But her words stayed with me all night as we listened to the whispers growing louder outside. The morning didn't bring relief. The sun barely rose, hidden behind thick clouds that made it feel like night never ended. The cold was worse than ever, sharp and biting, like it was alive and trying to get under our skin. Dr. Reed and I decided we couldn't stay in the station any longer. Whatever was out there wasn't going to let us sit and wait. Before we left, I checked the researchers' notes again, hoping to find something useful. That's when I found a folded piece of paper tucked into the back of the journal. It wasn't written by Dr. Reed. It was signed by the Athabascan guide who had been working with the team before he disappeared. The note was short, written in shaky handwriting. You have disturbed sacred ground. The ice is not just ice. It is alive. It waits for centuries until someone is foolish enough to wake it. Leave now, or it will take you too. I read the words out loud to Dr. Reed, and her face went pale. The burial site, she whispered. What, burial site? I asked. She hesitated, looking down at her hands like she didn't want to answer. When we were drilling, we found remains buried deep in the glacier. Bones, tools, things that looked ancient. We thought it was a discovery, something important, but we didn't realize. Her voice trailed off, but I didn't need her to finish. They'd disturbed something they shouldn't have, something that had been buried for a reason. I folded the note and slipped it into my pocket, feeling a heavy weight settle in my chest. The indigenous warning wasn't just superstition or folklore, it was real, and now we were paying the price for ignoring it. We need to move, I said, trying to push down the fear rising inside me. Dr. Reed nodded, but she looked terrified. It's tracking us, she said quietly. What do you mean? She pointed to the window where frost patterns had formed overnight. They weren't random. They looked like trails leading toward us, like something had been following our movements. From outside. It follows your breath, she said. The condensation. It uses it to find you. I stared at her, trying to process what she'd just said. It sounded impossible, like something out of a nightmare, but after everything I'd seen so far, how could I argue? We packed what little supplies we had left and prepared to leave. The station on foot. The emergency vehicle was useless, encased in ice so thick it looked like part of the glacier itself now. Before we stepped outside, Dr. Reed stopped me and grabbed my arm again. If you see it, don't run, she said firmly. Why not? I asked. She shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. It likes fear. Her words sent a chill down my spine that no amount of clothing could stop. We stepped out into the snow together, moving quickly but carefully through the frozen landscape. The air felt heavier than before, like every breath was being watched by something unseen. As we walked, I noticed strange shapes in the snow, patterns that looked almost like footprints but weren't quite human. They were long and thin, with sharp edges that glinted under the faint light of day. Dr. Reed kept glancing over her shoulder every few seconds, her face pale and tense. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to, but I could feel it too. We weren't alone out here. Then came the whispering again. It started softly at first, carried by the wind like before. But this time it was closer. It wasn't coming from one direction anymore. It surrounded us completely, echoing off the trees and snowbanks like a voice trapped in a frozen prison. I tightened my grip on my father's hunting knife as we kept moving forward, refusing to look back even though every instinct told me to, and then I saw it again. The frost walker stood just ahead of us near a cluster of trees, its translucent skin shimmering faintly in the dim light. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching us with an eerie stillness that made my stomach turn. Dr. Reed froze beside me, her breathing shallow as she whispered under her breath, "Don't run." I nodded slowly and forced myself to keep walking, even though every part of me wanted to turn around and sprint back to the station. The frost walker didn't follow us right away. It just stood there watching as though deciding whether or not we were worth its time. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't let us go easily. We kept moving through the snow, our steps slow and deliberate. Every crunch of our boots felt louder than it should have, like the sound might give us away. The frostwalker didn't follow us, not yet, but I could feel its presence, like the cold had a mind of its own and was pressing down on us from all sides. Dr. Reed was shaking, her breath coming out in uneven bursts of fog. I wanted to tell her it would be okay, but I couldn't bring myself to lie. Nothing about this was okay. The whispering followed us as we walked, growing louder and softer in waves like the wind was playing games with us. Sometimes it sounded far away, Other times it felt like it was right next to my ear. I tried to block it out, focusing on the path ahead, but it was impossible to ignore. Then Dr. Reed stopped suddenly. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She pointed ahead, her hand trembling. At first, I didn't see anything, just more snow and trees. But then I noticed the shapes. Ice formations were growing out of the ground in unnatural patterns, twisting and curling like frozen vines. They weren't random. They looked deliberate, almost like they were leading somewhere. "It's a trap," she said quietly. I nodded, gripping my knife tighter. Whatever this thing was, whatever it wanted, it wasn't going to let us leave without a fight. We turned and started heading in a different direction, trying to avoid the ice formations. But before we could get far, the whispering stopped all at once. The silence was worse than the sound. I turned to look at Dr. Reed, but before I could say anything, she screamed, a short, sharp cry that cut through the air like a knife. I spun around and saw her standing frozen in place, literally frozen. Ice was spreading across her body so fast I couldn't do anything to stop it. Her face twisted in horror as frost covered her skin, turning her pale blue and translucent like the bodies we'd seen in the station. "Eleanor!" I shouted, reaching for her. But before I could touch her, she was gone, completely encased in ice from head to toe. She stood there like a statue, her arms stretched out as if reaching for help that would never come. And then, she moved. Her head turned slowly, toward me, her frozen eyes locking onto mine. The crystals growing from her face glittered in the faint light as she took one stiff step forward. I stumbled back, my heart racing. This wasn't Eleanor anymore. This was something else entirely. She reached for me with one icy hand, and I swung my knife instinctively. The blade shattered against her skin like glass hitting stone. I turned and ran as fast as I could through the snow, my breath coming out in frantic bursts that felt like fire against my lungs. Behind me, I could hear the sound of cracking ice as Eleanor, or whatever she had become, followed me. The frost. Walker wasn't far behind. I made it back to the station and slammed the door shut behind me, locking it even though I knew it wouldn't hold for long. The cold was already creeping through the walls again, frost forming patterns that looked like faces staring back at me. I ran to the boiler room, the only place where heat still worked, and barricaded myself inside with whatever I could find: chairs, tools, anything that might slow them down. The heat from the boiler gave me a small sense of safety, but it wasn't enough to stop what was happening outside. The frost walker didn't need to break down doors or walls. It could manipulate ice itself to get what it wanted. As I sat there trying to catch my breath, the frost on the walls began shifting again, this time forming images instead of patterns. Faces appeared in the ice, faces I recognized. My war buddies from Korea stared back at me with hollow eyes and frozen expressions. Then came my ex-wife's face. Her smile twisted into something cruel and unnatural. It wasn't real, I knew that, but it felt real enough to make me question everything. The Frostwalker wasn't just hunting me, it was playing with me. I sat in the boiler room, staring at the flickering flames. My hands were shaking, and my thoughts were racing, but I couldn't afford to panic. Not now. The Frostwalker was out there, and Eleanor, what was left of her, was with it. I didn't know how much time I had before they broke through, but I knew I couldn't stay here forever. I tried to focus on the heat from the boiler, letting it remind me that there was still something alive in this frozen nightmare. But the frost creeping across the walls didn't care about the fire. It was relentless, twisting into shapes that seemed to mock me. That's when I noticed a stack of papers on one of the shelves. They looked old, yellowed with age, and stamped, with a government seal. I grabbed them and flipped through quickly, my eyes scanning for anything useful. What I found made my stomach turn. The documents weren't about glacial retreat or climate research. They were about something called Project Permafrost. The government had known about the Frostwalker for years, decades even. They'd been studying it, trying to figure out how to control it, how to use it as a weapon. Creature wasn't just ancient, it was prehistoric, older than humanity itself. It had been hibernating in the ice for thousands of years, waking only when disturbed. Its cycles of awakening lined up with major extinction events throughout Earth's history, events that wiped out entire species. And now, we'd woken it again. I clenched my fists, anger boiling inside me. They knew. The government knew what this thing was capable of, and they sent those researchers here anyway. They didn't care about the danger. They just wanted their weapon. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was surviving. I shoved the papers into my pack and started planning my next move. If I stayed here, I'd die. There was no question about that. But if I tried to fight back, maybe I could stop this thing before it killed anyone else. I remembered the fuel storage area near the station, the one place where there might be enough firepower to destroy the Frostwalker. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all I had. Grabbed my father's hunting knife and some tools from the shelves, then forced myself to step out into the cold again. The air hit me like a wall, stealing my breath and making my skin sting with every step. The snow around me glittered unnaturally, like shards of glass reflecting faint light from somewhere unseen. Every sound felt amplified. The crunch of my boots, the whispering wind, even my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. And then I saw them. Eleanor stood near the edge of the tree line, her frozen body moving in stiff, unnatural jerks. Her eyes locked onto mine as she took one slow step forward, then another. Behind her was the Frostwalker. It moved like smoke trapped in ice, fluid but sharp, its translucent skin shimmering faintly under the dim light. Its frozen organs were visible through its body, pulsing faintly like they were still alive despite being encased in ice. I didn't wait for them to get closer. I turned and ran toward the fuel storage area as fast as I could. My breath came out in frantic bursts that fogged up immediately in front of me, leaving a trail for them to follow. When I reached the storage area, I slammed the door shut behind me and started working quickly. The tanks were full of fuel, enough to create an explosion big enough to destroy anything nearby, but setting it off without killing myself would be tricky. I rigged an improvised trap using some tools and spare parts from my pack, a crude but effective setup that would ignite the fuel when triggered. My hands were shaking so badly it felt like they might drop everything at any moment, but somehow I managed to finish before they arrived. The door creaked open slowly behind me. I turned to face them, gripping my knife tightly even though I knew it wouldn't do much good. Eleanor stepped inside first, her movements stiff and unnatural like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. The Frostwalker followed her, its presence filling the room with an unbearable cold that made every breath feel like knives cutting into my lungs. "You want me?" I said through clenched teeth. "Come and get me." The Frostwalker tilted its head slightly as though considering my words. Then it lunged forward faster than I thought possible. I barely managed to dodge its icy hand as it swung toward me, but not completely. Its fingers grazed my arm and pain shot through me like fire turning into ice. When I looked down at my arm, part of it was already frozen solid. I didn't have time to think. I triggered the trap and dove for cover as flames erupted around me. The explosion shook the ground beneath me, sending shards of ice flying in all directions. Heat washed over me in a wave so intense it felt like it might burn away everything, including whatever was left of my frozen arm. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but ash and melted snow where they'd been standing. I stumbled outside into the freezing night air, clutching what remained of my arm as pain radiated through every part of me. My snowmobile was still nearby, miraculously untouched, and I climbed onto it with what little strength I had left. As I drove away from the station toward safety, or at least toward somewhere warmer, I noticed something strange, tiny blue crystals forming on my remaining hand. The drive back to the ranger station felt like a blur. The snowmobile roared beneath me, but the sound barely registered. My mind was stuck replaying everything I'd just seen, everything I'd just survived. The Frostwalker, Eleanor, the explosion. It all felt unreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. When I finally reached the main ranger station, I collapsed inside. My frozen arm was gone, shattered completely. But the pain still lingered, deep and sharp. The other rangers found me lying on the floor, barely conscious, and rushed me to the hospital in Fairbanks. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive. They didn't understand how frostbite could take my arm so quickly or why my body temperature had dropped so low despite my gear. I didn't bother explaining. It wasn't something they'd believe anyway. The official report came a few days later. The government claimed a fuel explosion had destroyed the research station and killed everyone inside. They called it an accident, said the cold had caused equipment to malfunction. They didn't mention the Frostwalker or what really happened out there. They didn't mention Eleanor or the bodies frozen solid in unnatural poses. They confiscated everything. The journal, the documents about Project Permafrost, even my own notes about what I'd seen. They told me to forget it, to move on with my life. But how could I? How do you forget something like that? I was discharged from service soon after. They said it was for psychological instability. But I knew better. They didn't want me talking about what happened in Denali. Not to anyone. For years, I tried to put it behind me. I moved away from Alaska. Tried to start fresh somewhere warmer, somewhere safer. But no matter how far I went, the cold followed me. In my dreams, in my memories, in my nightmares. And then, it started happening again. I saw it on the news. First, record-breaking temperatures in Denali National Park, colder than anything since 1959. Strange reports of missing hikers and unexplained ice formations deep in the backcountry. The whispers were starting again. I returned to Denali last winter. It felt like stepping back into a graveyard, a place where something ancient was still waiting beneath the snow and ice. Tonight, as I stand here staring up at the aurora lights, flickering above me, I feel it again. That cold presence pressing down on me like it never truly left. I look down at my hand, the one that's still mine, and see tiny blue crystals forming on my skin. It's not over. My name is Josephine Morales, but most people just call me Joe. I'm 33 years old, and I'm a park ranger. Not just any park ranger, I'm the first female head ranger in my district. It's a title I'm proud of, but if I'm being honest, it's been tough. Every day feels like I have to prove myself, especially to the men who think I don't belong here. But this isn't their story. It's mine. I took this job in Olympic National Park, Washington, about 6 months ago. It's remote, rainy, and quiet. Exactly what I needed after my divorce. The park is breathtaking in its own way. Towering, ancient cedar trees, moss-covered trails, and fog so thick it feels like you're walking through a dream. Or a nightmare. The weather this year has been strange. Record rainfall even for this part of the world. The forest is wetter than usual, and everything seems alive in a way that's hard to explain. The moss is thicker, the mushrooms are bigger, and there's this smell in the air, earthy but sharp, like something rotting just beneath the surface. One morning in early spring, I was out on patrol near an old cedar grove that doesn't get many visitors. The trees there are massive, some over 1,000 years old, and the place has always felt different from the rest of the park. Peaceful, but heavy, like it's holding on to secrets. I was checking on the trails when I noticed something odd. A tree with what looked like a face growing out of its trunk. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or maybe some natural pattern in the bark. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't just one face. It was several. Faint outlines of eyes, noses, mouths, all twisted and stretched like they were screaming silently from inside the wood. I shook it off as my imagination playing tricks on me and kept walking. But then I found something even stranger, an abandoned campsite deep in the grove. It looked like it had been there for years, rusted cookware, rotting sleeping bags, and faded tie-dye blankets hanging from branches like forgotten ghosts. The weirdest part, there were carvings on some of the trees around the camp, figures with hollow chests and long arms reaching out toward each other. They reminded me of something out of a nightmare, but also familiar somehow. Later that evening, back at my cabin, I started digging through some old records from the park office. Missing persons reports caught my eye, hikers who had vanished without a trace over the years. Most of them were last seen near that same cedar grove. The next day, I decided to take another look at the grove with fresh eyes. This time, I brought my walking stick, a custom-made one carved with patterns of native plants, and my camera to document anything unusual. As soon as I stepped into the grove again, that heavy feeling returned stronger than ever. The forest was eerily quiet except for the sound of rain dripping from the canopy above. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just silence broken by my own footsteps squelching through the mud. That's when I heard it. A faint sound carried on the wind like someone humming a tune just out of earshot. It seemed to be coming from deeper, within the grove near where a recent landslide had exposed part of an underground cave system. Curiosity got the better of me. I had to see what was making that sound. I followed the sound, my boots sinking into the wet earth with every step. The rain had picked up again, a steady drizzle that soaked through my jacket and made the air feel colder than it should have been. The humming grew louder as I got closer to the caves. It wasn't music exactly, more like a low, vibrating tone. That seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The landslide had torn through part of the grove, leaving behind a jagged scar in the earth. At the base of it was the entrance to a cave, dark and yawning like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. I hesitated for a moment, gripping my walking stick tighter. I wasn't scared, not exactly, but there was something about that cave that made my skin crawl. Just take a quick look, I muttered to myself. In and out. I turned on my flashlight and stepped inside. The air was damp and smelled like wet stone and something else. Something sharp and metallic that made me want to hold my breath. The walls were covered in moss and strange fungi, some of them glowing faintly in shades of green and blue. I'd never seen anything like it before, and I've seen plenty of mushrooms in my time as a ranger. As I moved deeper into the cave, the humming grew louder, almost like it was coming from the walls themselves. My flashlight beam caught something. Ahead, a cluster of mushrooms growing in a perfect circle on the ground. They were huge, with caps as wide as dinner plates and stems that seemed to pulse faintly, like they were alive. I crouched down to get a closer look, careful not to touch anything. That's when I noticed something strange about the ground beneath them. It wasn't rock or dirt. It looked soft, almost like skin. A shiver ran down my spine. But before I could think too much about it, I heard footsteps behind me. "Hello?" I called out, standing up quickly and shining my flashlight toward the cave entrance. A man stepped into the light, tall and thin with glasses fogged up from the rain. He looked just as surprised to see me as I was to see him. "Oh, sorry," he said, holding up his hands like he didn't want to scare me. "I didn't mean to startle you." "Who are you?" I asked, lowering my flashlight but keeping my guard up. "Dr. Leonard Powell," he said with a nervous smile. "I'm a mycologist, a mushroom scientist." He gestured toward the glowing fungi around us. "I've been studying these for weeks now. Fascinating species." I frowned. "You're not supposed to be here without a permit." "I know," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. "But when I heard about this cave system opening up after the landslide, well, I couldn't resist." I sighed, but decided not to press him too hard just yet. "What do you know about these mushrooms?" I asked instead, pointing at the circle on the ground. Powell's face lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. "They're incredible. bioluminescent fungi with properties unlike anything I've ever seen before. He crouched down beside me and pointed at one of the caps. See how they're connected? It's part of a larger network, like an underground web that links them all together. Like roots? I asked, trying to follow what he was saying. Sort of, he said, nodding eagerly. But more advanced than that, almost like they're communicating with each other. I didn't know what to make of that, but before I could ask more questions, something caught my eye near the edge of my flashlight beam, a backpack lying against the cave wall. It looked newish, not like it had been there for long. Is that yours? I asked Powell, pointing at it. He shook, his head slowly, his excitement fading into confusion. No, I don't think so. We walked over to it together, both of us uneasy now. The backpack was damp but intact, filled with camping gear and food wrappers that hadn't even started to rot yet. Definitely recent. But there was no sign of its owner. Then we heard it, a voice calling out from deeper in the cave. It sounded weak and far away, a man's voice yelling for help. Powell looked at me nervously. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. "Stay here," I told him firmly before stepping toward the sound. The voice echoed through the cave, faint but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. "Help! Someone! Please!" I hesitated for a second, shining my flashlight deeper into the darkness. The beam barely pierced the shadows, and I couldn't see where the voice was coming from. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't just ignore someone who might be in trouble. "Hello?" I called out, my voice bouncing off the walls. "Where are you? Are you hurt?" No answer. Just the sound of dripping water and that low humming vibration in the background. Powell stayed behind, looking pale and uneasy. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" he asked nervously. "No," I admitted, gripping my walking stick tightly. "But if someone's in danger, I have to check it out." I took a few cautious steps forward, every muscle in my body tense. The air felt heavier the deeper I went, like the cave itself was pressing down on me. The glow from the fungi on the walls seemed brighter now, casting strange shadows that danced and flickered as I moved. Then I saw it. A figure standing just ahead, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and thin, its back turned to me. "Hey!" I called out, relief flooding through me for a moment. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The figure didn't move or respond. It just stood there, completely still. Something about it felt wrong. My flashlight beam shook slightly as I raised it higher, trying to get a better look. That's when I realized it wasn't a person at all. It was part of the cave wall, covered in fungi and moss that had grown into a shape eerily similar to a human body. I took a step back, my heart pounding harder now. What was this place? Before I could process what I was seeing, Powell's voice broke through my thoughts from behind me. "Joe, look at this." I turned and hurried back toward him, glad for an excuse to leave that strange figure behind. He was crouched near one of the glowing mushroom clusters, holding something in his hands. A small notebook with a worn leather cover. "I found this near the backpack," he said, flipping it open carefully. The pages were damp but still readable, filled with messy handwriting and sketches of mushrooms and trees. "It looks like a journal," Powell continued, scanning the pages quickly. "Whoever wrote this was studying these fungi, too." I leaned over his shoulder to read some of it myself. Most of it was scientific notes that didn't make much sense to me. Descriptions of spore patterns, diagrams of fungal networks, but one entry caught my eye. They're not just plants. They're something more. Something alive in ways we don't understand yet. The next page had a drawing that made my stomach twist. One of those hollow-chested figures carved into the trees near the abandoned campsite. Underneath it were 3 words scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Don't trust them." I didn't like where this was going. We need to get out of here, I said firmly, snapping Powell out of his fascination with the journal. But there's so much more to learn. He started to argue. Not now. I cut him off, my voice sharper than I intended. Something about this place isn't right. Powell reluctantly followed me back toward the entrance of the cave. But as we stepped outside into the rain again, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone anymore. That night, back at my cabin, I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd found: the strange mushrooms, the journal, and especially that figure in the cave wall that looked so human it made my skin crawl. I decided to dig deeper into park records again. If people had been disappearing near this grove for years, there had to be something about it in old ranger reports or local stories. Sure enough, after hours of searching through dusty files and faded papers, I found what I was looking for. A series of reports from decades ago describing strange sightings in the grove. Figures moving between trees that vanished when approached. Voices calling out from nowhere. Entire logging crews disappearing without a trace. Most of these reports had been redacted or dismissed as unsubstantiated claims. But they all pointed to one thing. There was something wrong with this part of the forest. The next day, I decided to visit an elder from one of the local indigenous tribes who lived nearby. A man named Samuel who'd helped us with cultural preservation projects before. When I told him about what I'd seen and heard in the grove, his expression grew serious. "You've seen them," he said quietly after a long pause. "Seen what?" I asked. "The empty people," he replied grimly. "They live in the trees, and they don't let go." Samuel's words stuck with me long after I left his house. The empty people. They live in the trees, and they don't let go. I wanted to dismiss it as a legend, a story meant to scare children or explain things that couldn't be explained. But after what I'd seen in the grove and the cave, I wasn't so sure anymore. The next few days were a blur of rain, paperwork, and restless nights. I couldn't stop thinking about the journal Powell had found or the strange carvings on the trees. Something was happening in that grove, and I was starting to feel like I was in over my head. Powell, on the other hand, seemed more fascinated than ever. He'd set up a makeshift lab in one of the park's storage sheds and spent all his time studying the fungal samples he'd collected from the cave. "You have to see this," he said one morning when I stopped by to check on him. His voice was excited, but his face looked pale and tired, like he hadn't slept in days. He held up a petri dish with a thin layer of fungi growing inside it. "Watch," he said, pointing to a small drop of water he'd just added to the dish. Leaned in closer as the fungi started to move, tiny tendrils reaching out toward each other like they were alive. "It's reacting," Powell said, his voice full of wonder. "It's almost like it's aware." I stepped back, uneasy. "That's not normal," I said quietly. "No," he agreed, staring at the dish like it held all the answers in the world. "It's something new, something incredible." Didn't share his enthusiasm. If anything, it made me more certain that we were dealing with something we didn't understand, and probably shouldn't be messing with. Later that afternoon, we got a call about 2 hikers who hadn't returned, from a trail near the grove. It wasn't unusual for people to lose track of time out here, especially with how dense the forest could get. But given everything that had been happening lately, my gut told me this was different. Powell insisted on coming along for the search, despite my protests. "If it's connected to the fungi, I need to see it for myself," he said stubbornly. We found their campsite just before sunset. A tent half collapsed under the weight of rainwater, backpacks still zipped shut, and food untouched in their cooler. It looked like they'd just walked away and never come back. That's when we saw it, the first body. It was lying face down near the edge of the grove, partially covered in moss and mushrooms that seemed to be growing out of its skin. My stomach turned as I crouched down to get a closer look. The man's chest was hollowed out completely, just an empty cavity where his heart and lungs should have been. The edges of the wound were lined with fungal growths that pulsed faintly, almost like they were breathing. Powell knelt beside me, his face pale but his eyes wide with fascination. "It's using him," he whispered. "Feeding on him." "We need to call this in," I said firmly, standing up and reaching for my radio. But before I could say anything else, we heard a voice calling out from deeper in the grove. A woman's voice this time, crying for help. "Stay here," I told Powell again, but he didn't listen. He followed me as I moved toward the sound, my flashlight cutting through the fog that had started to roll in. We found her, or what was left of her, leaning against one of the massive cedar trees. Her eyes were open but unseeing, her mouth frozen mid-scream. Like the man we'd found earlier, her chest was hollowed out completely. But what made my blood run cold was what happened next. The tree behind her moved. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe a trick of the light. But then I saw it clearly. Long, thin branches shifting like arms as they pulled her deeper into the trunk. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight as Powell grabbed my arm. "Did you see that?" he whispered hoarsely. Before I could answer, we heard another voice, this one familiar. "Joe, over here." It was Richard Keller, one of our search party members who'd gone ahead earlier. We ran toward his voice but stopped dead in our tracks when we found him. Or rather, where we found him. His voice was coming from inside one of the trees. "Joe, help me!" His voice sounded desperate and muffled, like he was trapped somewhere deep inside. I shined my flashlight on the tree and saw something that made my stomach twist. Faint outlines of eyes and a mouth pressed against the bark from inside, as if Keller was part of the tree now. Powell turned to me with wide eyes. "They're merging with them," he said breathlessly. "Becoming part of them." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. All I could do was stare at that tree as Keller's voice faded into silence. I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the ground, just like Keller was rooted inside that tree. His voice was gone now, but the forest around us seemed alive in a way I'd never noticed before. Every creak of the branches, every rustle of the leaves, it all felt deliberate, like the trees were watching us. Powell grabbed my arm, snapping me out of my daze. "We need to go," he said, his voice shaking. For once, I didn't argue. We turned and ran back toward the edge of the grove, our flashlights bouncing wildly in the dark. The rain had started again, soaking us to the bone and making the ground slick and treacherous. When we finally made it back to the trailhead, I doubled over, trying to catch my breath. Powell was pacing nervously, muttering to himself about what we'd seen. "This isn't just a fungus," he said, his voice rising with panic. "It's a colony, a hive mind. It's intelligent." I didn't want to believe him, but deep down, I knew he was right. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just growing in the forest. It was the forest. The next morning, I went back to Samuel's house. I needed answers, and he was the only person who seemed to know anything about what was happening. When I told him about Keller and the hikers we'd found, his expression darkened. He sat quietly for a moment, staring into his cup of tea like it held some kind of secret. "They've been here longer than we have," he said finally. "Longer than anyone remembers." "What are they?" I asked, leaning forward. Samuel sighed heavily. "The old stories say they came from the sky, something that fell to earth long ago and took root in the forest. At first, it was just plants and fungi. But then it started taking people." "Why?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Shook his head slowly. "No one knows for sure. Some say it's feeding on them. Others say it's trying to become human." I felt a chill run down my spine at his words. "How do we stop it?" I asked. Samuel looked at me with tired eyes. "You don't," he said simply. "You stay away from it and pray it doesn't notice you." But staying away wasn't an option anymore. Not after what had happened to Keller and those hikers. That afternoon, Powell and I went back to the grove with a small team of rangers led by Deputy Chief Ranger Wilson. Wilson wasn't happy about any of this. He thought it was just some kind of fungal infection that had gotten out of hand. but he agreed to help investigate after I showed him the journal Powell had found. The rain had let up by then, but the forest was still shrouded in mist. The air felt heavy and damp as we made our way back toward the cave system. Wilson stopped suddenly as we approached the entrance. He pointed at something on the ground, an exposed root covered in glowing fungi that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. "What is that?" one of the other rangers asked nervously. "It's part of the colony," Powell said quietly. "It's all connected, above ground and below." We followed the route into the cave system, our flashlights cutting through the darkness as we went deeper and deeper underground. That's when we found them. The bodies. Dozens of them. They were scattered throughout the cavern in various stages of transformation, some fully merged with the walls or floor, others still recognizable as human but covered in fungal growths that pulsed and glowed faintly in the dim light. I felt bile rise in my throat as I realized these weren't just random victims. They were people who had gone missing over decades. Hikers, loggers, even park rangers like Keller. "They're preserving them," Powell whispered in awe as he examined one of the bodies more closely, "keeping their consciousness alive somehow. Part of their network." I didn't want to hear any more. I just wanted to get out of there. But then something moved at the far end of the cavern, a shape emerging from one of the massive cedar roots that snaked through the cave. It was Powell. It looked like him. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, his eyes glowing faintly with an unnatural light. He stepped forward slowly, his movements jerky and unnatural like a puppet on strings. "Joe," he said softly, his voice echoing strangely in the cavern. "Join us." I stumbled back in horror as Powell, or whatever he'd become, reached out toward me with thin, branch-like fingers. Wilson fired his gun without hesitation, the sound deafening in the confined space. But it didn't do anything. The thing that used to be Powell didn't even flinch as it melted back into one of the cedar roots and disappeared. "We're leaving," Wilson barked, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the exit. But as we turned to go, I saw something at the center of the cavern. A massive fungal growth pulsing with light like a giant heart buried deep within the earth. And I knew then that this wasn't just about saving ourselves anymore. If we didn't destroy that thing, it would never stop spreading. I couldn't stop thinking about the heart, the massive fungal growth pulsing in the center of the cavern. It felt alive, like it was breathing, and I knew deep down that it was the source of everything. The hollow, men, the strange trees, the voices, it all came from that thing. Back at the ranger station, Wilson paced back and forth, his face grim. "We need to contain this," he said finally. "If this spreads beyond the grove—" He didn't finish the sentence, but we all knew what he meant. "Fire," I said quietly. "It's the only way." Wilson stopped pacing and looked at me. "You're serious?" I nodded. "I've seen what it does to people. Guns don't work. Nothing else works. We have to destroy it completely, burn it down to ash." The other rangers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one argued. We all knew there wasn't any other choice. That night, we prepared for the burn. The plan was simple. Use controlled fires to destroy the grove and collapse the cave system where the fungal heart was located. It wasn't ideal. There was a risk of the fire spreading beyond our control, but it was better than letting this thing spread unchecked. The rain had eased up slightly, but lightning flashed in the distance as we loaded up our gear and headed back into the grove. The storm would make things harder, but it also gave us an opportunity. If we could use the lightning to ignite the heart directly, we might be able to destroy it faster. As we approached the cave entrance again, I felt that heavy, oppressive feeling settle over me like a weight on my chest. The forest seemed quieter than before. No birds, no wind, just silence broken by the occasional rumble of thunder. We set up our equipment quickly, working in tense silence as Wilson gave orders. The plan was for me and 2 other rangers to go into the cave and plant charges near the heart while Wilson stayed outside to monitor conditions. But before we could start, something moved in the shadows. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, or maybe one of us shifting nervously. But then I saw them. The Hollow Men. They stepped out from between the trees one by one, pale figures with hollow chests and glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Their movements were slow and deliberate, like they were studying us. One of them opened its mouth and spoke, not in its own voice, but in Keller's voice. "Joe," it said softly, its tone pleading. "Don't do this." Another spoke in Powell's voice. "You don't understand. We can save you." I froze for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. They weren't just mimicking voices. They were using them against us, trying to confuse us or make us hesitate. Wilson fired his gun again, but just like before, it didn't do anything. The Hollow Men melted back into the trees as if they were part of them. "We don't have time for this," Wilson shouted. "Get inside and plant those charges." Inside the cave, everything felt worse than before. The walls seemed closer now, almost like they were closing in on us as we moved deeper toward the heart. The other rangers worked quickly to set up explosives while I kept watch with my flashlight and walking stick. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold on to either one. Then I heard it. The humming sound again, louder this time and almost deafening as we got closer to the heart. It pulsed in front of us like a living thing, massive and glowing, with faint blue light that seemed to ripple through its surface. For a moment, I felt something strange, a pull toward it, like it was calling me somehow. My vision blurred as spores filled the air around me, making me feel dizzy and disoriented. I saw flashes of images, people's faces merging with trees, voices crying out for help, Powell standing beside me with glowing eyes saying, "It's beautiful." I stumbled back as one of the rangers grabbed my arm. "Joe, are you okay?" I shook my head hard, trying to clear my thoughts. "Plant the charges," I managed to say through gritted teeth. As we finished setting up and started heading back toward the entrance, lightning struck outside, bright enough to light up the entire cavern for a split second. The Hollow Men appeared. Again, this time surrounding us completely. They didn't attack right away. Instead, they just stood there watching us with hollow chests glowing faintly in rhythm with the fungal heart behind them. One stepped forward and spoke again. Not in Keller's voice or Powell's voice, but in mine. "Joe," it said softly, its tone calm and almost soothing. "You don't have to fight us." I gripped my walking stick tighter as anger replaced fear inside me. "You took them," I said through clenched teeth. "You took all of them." The Hollow Man tilted its head slightly like it was confused, or maybe amused, and then stepped back into formation with the others. We made it outside just as another lightning strike hit near the grove, and that's when Wilson detonated the charges. The explosion rocked through the ground beneath us as flames erupted from inside the cave system, and for a moment, everything went still except for thunder rumbling overhead. But then came a sound, a low roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if something deep within the earth was screaming in pain. And then, silence. For a moment it felt like we'd done it. The flames roared inside the cave, and the ground beneath us trembled as if the forest itself was reacting to what we'd done. The rain started to pour harder, sizzling against the fire and sending up plumes of steam that made it hard to see. But then I heard it, that humming sound again, louder than ever. It wasn't coming from the cave anymore. It was coming from everywhere. The trees around us began to move, their branches twisting and reaching like they were alive. The Hollow Men stepped out from between the trunks, their hollow chests glowing faintly in the stormy darkness. They didn't look human anymore. Whatever remnants of humanity they'd once had were gone. I felt a sharp pain in my chest and stumbled back, clutching at my shirt. My vision blurred as spores filled the air around me, swirling in the rain like tiny flecks of ash. I could feel them crawling into my lungs, into my skin, into me. "Joe!" Wilson shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me away from the grove. We have to go, but I couldn't move. The spores were doing something to me, pulling me into their world, showing me things I didn't want to see. I saw Keller's face, pale and twisted as he merged with a tree. I saw Powell's glowing eyes as he disappeared into the fungal network. And then I saw myself, standing in the middle of the grove with hollow eyes and a glowing chest. Just like them. "No," I whispered, shaking my head violently. "No, I'm not yours." I gripped my walking stick tightly and swung it at one of the hollow men as it reached for me. The carved wood connected with its chest, and for a brief moment, it dissolved into a cloud of spores before reforming again further away. Wilson fired his gun at another one, but it was no use. They just kept coming. That's when I realized what I had to do. "The heart," I said through gritted teeth, forcing myself to stand upright despite the pain in my chest. "It's not dead yet." Wilson looked at me like I was crazy. "Are you out of your mind? You can't go back in. There. I have to," I said firmly, gripping my walking stick like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. "If we don't destroy it completely, this will never stop." Before he could argue, I turned and ran back toward the cave entrance. The flames were still burning inside, but they were starting to die down as the rain poured harder. The hollow. Men didn't try to stop me this time. They just watched silently as I disappeared into the darkness. Inside the cave, the air was thick with smoke and spores that made it hard to breathe. The fungal heart was still there, pulsing faintly in the dim light like it was struggling to stay alive. I didn't have much time. Lightning flashed outside again, illuminating the cavern for a split second. And that's when I saw them. The faces. Dozens of them pressed into the walls of the cave. Men and women who had been taken by the colony over decades or maybe even centuries. Their eyes were closed, their mouths frozen mid-scream as if they were trapped somewhere between life and death. And then they opened their eyes. "Joe," they whispered in unison, their voices echoing through my mind like a chorus of ghosts. Stumbled back, clutching at my head as their voices grew louder. "Join us." "No!" I screamed, raising my walking stick above my head like a weapon. The heart pulsed harder now as if it could sense what I was about to do. With all the strength I had left, I drove the sharp end of my walking stick straight into its center. The heart let out a deafening roar that shook the entire cavern as bright blue light erupted from within it. The walls trembled violently as chunks of rock began to fall around me. I turned and ran as fast as I could toward the entrance just as another lightning strike hit outside. This one so close that it lit up everything around me like daylight. The last thing I saw before diving out of the cave was the heart collapsing in on itself in a blinding flash of light. When I woke up later, everything was quiet. The rain had stopped, and the grove was eerily still. No movement, no sound except for my own ragged breathing. Wilson found me lying near the edge of the grove, covered in mud and ash, but somehow still alive. "It's over," he said quietly as he helped me to my feet. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. In the weeks that followed, life went back to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after something like that. The official story was that a lightning strike had caused a fire in part of the forest, a convenient explanation that kept people from asking too many questions. But every time it rained after that night, I couldn't shake this feeling, that heavy weight on my chest like something was still watching me from deep within the forest. And then, one morning, I noticed something strange. A small hollow had started forming in my palm, just big enough for a single drop of rain to collect inside it. I stared at it for a long time before pulling on my gloves and heading out into another stormy day. My name is Derek Redhawk. I'm a park ranger at Canyonlands National Park in Utah. I'm 42 years old, a Vietnam veteran, and a Navajo, Dene, as we call ourselves. After years of being away from my ancestral lands, I finally returned, hoping to find some peace. But peace is a rare thing out here, especially during a summer like this one. The drought has been brutal. The air is dry as bone, and the red dust gets into everything. Your clothes, your lungs, even your thoughts. Static electricity crackles in the air so much that you can feel it on your skin. It's as if the land itself is restless, waiting for something to happen. It all started with a distress signal. The call came in late one afternoon from a restricted section of the park, an area closed off because of old uranium mines left behind from the 1950s. The mines are dangerous, unstable, and full of toxic gas. No one's supposed to be there, but the signal was clear. Someone was in trouble. I grabbed my gear, radio, flashlight, first aid kit, and headed out in my Jeep. The sun was low on the horizon, painting the sandstone cliffs in deep reds and oranges. The beauty of this place never gets old, but that day, it felt off. The wind carried an eerie silence with it, broken only by the occasional rustle of dry brush. The signal led me to a narrow canyon, a place I'd never been before. The walls were steep and close together, and every sound seemed to echo strangely. My radio crackled with static as I tried to call for backup, but no one responded. That wasn't unusual in these canyons. They tend to mess with radio signals. As I walked deeper into the canyon, I found something odd. Abandoned equipment scattered on the ground. An old radio transmitter, some camping gear, and what looked like scientific instruments covered in dust. There was a notebook lying nearby. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, but I could still make out some of the writing. The notes were strange, ramblings about something following us, and voices in the wind. One entry caught my eye. It's always just out of sight. We hear it at night, but never see it. The handwriting grew shakier with each page until it stopped altogether. I felt a chill run down my spine despite the heat. Something wasn't right here. As I moved further into the canyon, I found more signs of trouble. Footprints leading in circles as if someone had been running aimlessly, and claw marks on the sandstone walls that didn't look like they came from any animal I knew. Then there were the animals, or rather, the lack of them. Normally, you'd see lizards darting across rocks or hear birds chirping overhead. But here, nothing. It was dead silent except for the occasional gust of wind. Finally, I reached a clearing where the signal had been strongest. There was no one there, just more abandoned gear and what looked like dried blood on a rock. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I called out into the canyon. "Hello? Is anyone here? Do you need help?" No answer. As I turned to head back to my Jeep, I noticed something strange out of the corner of my eye. A shadow that didn't belong to me moving along the canyon wall. When I spun around to look directly at it, nothing was there. That's when my radio crackled to life with a voice that made my blood run cold. Help. Me. It was faint and distorted, but unmistakably human. "Who is this?" I asked, gripping the radio tightly. The voice repeated itself. "Help. Me." Then it cut off abruptly. I stood there frozen for what felt like an eternity before forcing myself to move. Whatever was going on here wasn't natural, and it wasn't safe. I hurried back to my Jeep as fast as I could without running outright. The sun had dipped below the horizon by then, and shadows stretched long across the desert floor. As I drove back toward the ranger station, one thought kept running through my mind. What did I just stumble into? Little did I know. This was only the beginning. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I sat in the ranger station, staring at the notebook I'd brought back from the canyon. The words, "something following us," kept running through my head like a broken record. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. I decided to visit my uncle, Thomas Redhawk. He's a tribal elder and one of the wisest men I know. If anyone could make sense of this, it was him. His house is a small, weathered place on the edge of the reservation, surrounded by sagebrush and open sky. When I showed him the notebook and told him about what I'd seen and heard in the canyon, he didn't say anything at first. He just sat there, staring at the pages with a serious look on his face. Finally, he spoke. "You shouldn't have gone there, Derek," he said quietly. "That place is cursed." "Cursed?" I asked, trying not to sound skeptical. "What do you mean?" He leaned back in his chair and let out a long sigh. "There are stories, old stories, about skinwalkers in those canyons. They're not just legends, they're real." I frowned. Skinwalkers were something I'd heard about growing up. According to Navajo tradition, they're witches who can take the form of animals or even other people. But they were always just stories to me. Scary tales told around campfires, to keep kids from wandering too far at night. "You think this has something to do with a skinwalker?" I asked. "I know it does," he said firmly. "The signs are all there. The strange noises, the shadows that don't belong, the animals staying away. That's how they work. They trick you, confuse you, and if you're not careful, they'll take more than just your life." His words sent a shiver down my spine. What should I do? "Stay away from that canyon," he said, his voice grave. "And if you see or hear anything strange, anything that feels wrong, you leave immediately. Don't try to fight it." I nodded, but deep down, I wasn't sure if I could follow his advice. As a ranger, it was my job to protect the park and anyone in it. If someone was in danger out there, I couldn't just walk away. Later that day, we got another report. A group of college geology students had gone missing near the restricted zone. They'd been camping in an area not far from where I'd found the abandoned gear. I volunteered to lead the search. As we set out into the desert, something felt off. The wind had picked up again, carrying with it that same eerie silence I'd noticed before. Even my fellow rangers seemed uneasy, though no one said anything. We split up to cover more ground, and I found myself heading toward another narrow canyon. As soon as I stepped inside, my radio started acting up again. Static, mixed with faint voices that seemed to come from nowhere. "Derek. Derek." The voice was faint but unmistakable. It sounded like my own name being called from somewhere deep in the canyon. I froze in place, every muscle in my body tensing up. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing off the sandstone walls. No answer. I kept moving forward cautiously, scanning every shadow and crevice with my flashlight. That's when I saw it. A coyote standing perfectly still on a rock ledge above me. Its eyes glowed unnaturally bright in the fading light. At first, I thought it was just another animal trying to survive in this harsh environment. But then, something strange happened. It didn't move. Not an inch. It just stared at me with those glowing eyes as if it were studying me. I took a step back instinctively, and as soon as I did, the coyote disappeared, vanished without a sound. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned around and hurried back toward the others. When I reached them, one of the rangers told me they'd found tracks leading deeper into another canyon, a sign that maybe the students were still alive. But all I could think about was what my uncle had said. Stay away from that canyon. Something was out here with us, something ancient and dangerous, and we were walking right into its territory. And for some reason, it felt like it was waiting for me. By the time we reached the deeper canyon, the sun was starting to set. The shadows stretched long across the sandstone walls, and the air felt heavier, like something was pressing down on us. The other rangers, Didn't say much, but I could tell they were uneasy. So was I. We followed the tracks until we found one of the students, or at least that's what we thought at first. She was sitting on a rock near a dry creek bed, her back turned to us. Her clothes were dusty and torn, and her hair hung limp over her shoulders. "Miss, are you okay?" I called out as I approached her. She didn't respond right away. When she finally turned around, something about her didn't seem right. Her face looked pale, almost grayish, and her eyes didn't seem to focus on anything. It was like she was looking through me instead of at me. "I got lost," she said in a flat, emotionless voice. I knelt down next to her and tried to check for injuries. "Are you hurt? Where are the others?" She didn't answer my questions. Instead, she said something that made my blood run cold. "You were in Vietnam." I froze. There was no way she could know that. I hadn't mentioned it to anyone here, and it wasn't something strangers could guess just by looking at me. "How do you know that?" I asked carefully. She tilted her head slightly and smiled. A strange, unnatural smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You saved people in helicopters." I stood up quickly and stepped back from her. My heart was pounding now, and every instinct I had told me something was very wrong. Before I could say anything else, another ranger called out from behind me. "Derek, over here." I turned to see him waving me over to a small cave entrance nearby. Relieved to get away from the girl for a moment, I hurried over to him. Inside the cave, we found more signs of the students: backpacks, water bottles, and even a pair of hiking boots, but no people. The walls of the cave were covered in strange marks that looked like scratches or carvings. Some of them reminded me of the petroglyphs I'd seen in other parts of the park, symbols left behind by ancient tribes. "What do you think happened here?" the ranger asked me. "I don't know," I admitted, though my mind was racing with possibilities. None of them good. When we stepped back outside, the girl was gone. We searched the area but couldn't find any trace of her. Not even footprints, leading away from where she'd been sitting. It was like she had vanished into thin air. That night, as we made camp near the canyon entrance, things got even stranger. The wind picked up again, carrying with it faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. At first, I thought it was just my imagination or the sound of the wind moving through the rocks. But then I started hearing words, my name being called, softly from somewhere out in the darkness. "Derek, Derek." I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the area around our camp, but there was nothing there, just shadows and silence. The other rangers were asleep, or pretending to be. They didn't seem to hear what I was hearing. Then came the animals, the ones that shouldn't have been there. A flock of birds flew overhead in perfect formation, despite the wind being strong, enough to knock them off course. Coyotes howled in unison from different directions as if they were coordinating their cries, and then there were footsteps, soft but unmistakable, circling our camp just outside the range of my flashlight beam. I called out into the darkness, "Who's there? Show yourself." No answer, but as I turned back toward my tent, I saw something that made my stomach drop, a piece of skin lying on the ground near the edge of camp. It looked human, but wrong somehow. It was thin and stretched out like it had been shed rather than cut or torn. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like someone, or something, was watching me. The next morning, when we packed up to continue our search for the students, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever we were looking for wasn't human anymore. And worse, it seemed like it already knew who I was. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the missing students or the strange things I'd seen. It was the way the land itself felt. The air was heavy, like it was holding its breath, and every sound seemed sharper, louder, more alive. We split up again to cover more ground. I paired up with Linda Walsh, another ranger I trusted. She was tough and experienced, but even she looked uneasy as we headed deeper into the restricted zone. Do you believe in all those old stories? She asked me as we hiked through a maze of slot canyons. Which ones? I replied, though I already knew what she meant. Skinwalkers, she said quietly. I've heard people talk about them before. My grandmother used to tell me they could take your face, make you think they were someone you knew. I didn't answer right away. I don't know, I said finally, but I've seen enough out here to know that not everything can be explained. She nodded, but the look on her face told me she wasn't reassured. We followed a faint trail of footprints deeper into the canyon until we reached a narrow passage where the walls were so close together you could barely walk through without turning sideways. The air was cooler here, almost cold, and the shadows seemed darker than they should have been. That's when we heard it. A voice calling out from somewhere ahead. Help! Somebody help me! Linda froze and looked at me. That sounds like one of them. I nodded and raised my flashlight, scanning the passage ahead. Stay close, I said as we moved forward cautiously. The voice grew louder as we approached, but something about it felt off. It sounded too perfect, too clear, like it wasn't coming from a real person but from a recording being played back. When we rounded a corner, we saw someone standing in the middle of the canyon. A man wearing hiking gear that looked like it belonged to one of the missing students. He was facing away from us, his shoulders slumped like he was exhausted. Sir, are you okay? Linda called out. He didn't answer right away. When he finally turned around, my stomach dropped. His face looked normal at first glance, but his eyes were wrong. They were too dark, too empty, like there was nothing behind them. I got lost, he said in a flat voice that sounded eerily familiar. Linda stepped forward to help him, but I grabbed her arm and stopped her. Wait, I said quietly. Something's not right. She frowned at me but stayed where she was. The man tilted his head slightly and smiled. A strange, unnatural smile that made my skin crawl. Then he said something that made my heart stop. You saved people in Vietnam. It was the same thing the girl had said the day before. The same words in the same flat tone. Linda turned to me with wide eyes. How does he know that? I don't think he's one of them, I whispered back. Before either of us could say anything else, the man suddenly lunged at us with unnatural speed. His movements were jerky and wrong, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. We scrambled backward as he reached for us, his hands clawing at the air like he was trying to grab onto something that wasn't there. Then he stopped abruptly and stood perfectly still, too still, before turning and running off into the shadows faster than any human should have been able to move. Linda looked at me with fear in her eyes. What was that? I don't know, I said honestly, but it's not human. We decided to head back to camp and regroup with the others. As we walked back through the canyon, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every time I turned around, there was nothing there, but I could feel it watching us. When we reached camp, things got worse. One of the other rangers approached us with a strange look on his face, like he wasn't sure if he should say what he was about to say. You're not going to believe this, he said finally. But Linda came back earlier today. I froze and looked at him sharply. What are you talking about? She's been with me all day. He shook his head. No. She came back alone about an hour ago. I turned to Linda beside me, but she looked just as confused as I felt. What do you mean? She asked him. I mean, she walked into camp and started talking to us like everything was normal, he said slowly. But then she disappeared again. My blood ran cold as his words sank in. Something out here had taken Linda's face, and now it knew exactly how to trick us. The hunter had become the hunted, and it wasn't done with us yet. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. The camp felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. Every time the wind rustled the tents or a twig snapped in the distance, I found myself gripping my flashlight tighter, waiting for something to show itself. Linda sat across from me by the fire, her face pale and drawn. Do you think it's really out there? she asked softly. I didn't answer right away. I don't think it's just out there, I said finally. I think it's watching us. Her eyes darted toward the shadows beyond the firelight, and I could see her trying not to let fear take over. I was doing the same thing. The next morning, I decided to go back to my uncle. I needed answers, something to make sense of what we were dealing with. Linda insisted on coming with me, saying she didn't want to be alone in camp after what had happened. When we reached his house, he was already outside, sitting on his porch like he'd been waiting for us. His face looked grim as he waved us over. "You saw it, didn't you?" he said before I could even speak. I nodded. It's not just one thing. It's changing, taking people's faces. He nodded slowly, like he'd expected this. "That's how it survives," he said. "It takes what it needs, your voice, your face, your memories, and leaves behind nothing but a shell." Linda shivered beside me. "How do we stop it?" My uncle shook his head. "You don't stop it," he said firmly. "You contain it." He led us inside and pulled out an old book, one filled with drawings and symbols that looked ancient. He flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for, an illustration of a gaunt figure with a deer skull for a head surrounded by symbols carved into stone. "This is what you're dealing with," he said, pointing to the drawing. "It's older than anything we know, older than humans themselves. The tribes who lived here before us knew about it and found ways to trap it." "How?" I asked. "Ceremonial seals," he explained. "They used symbols and rituals to bind it to certain places, places where it couldn't escape." He paused and looked at me seriously. "But those seals were broken when the uranium mines were dug up." My stomach sank as his words hit me. The mining boom in the 1950s had disturbed something ancient, something that should have stayed buried. Linda frowned at the book. "If they trapped it once, can we do it again?" My uncle hesitated before answering. "It won't be easy," he said finally. "It's stronger now, more dangerous than ever." He showed us a map of the area and pointed to a spot deep in the restricted zone, a place marked with symbols similar to those in the book. "This is where they trapped it before," he said. "If you can lure it there and perform the ceremony, you might be able to contain it again." "Might?" Linda asked nervously. "It's your only chance," my uncle said firmly. Before we left, he handed me a pouch filled with herbs and powders used in traditional ceremonies. "Use this wisely," he said. "And remember, don't trust anything you see or hear out there." I nodded and thanked him before heading back to camp with Linda. As we drove through the desert, I couldn't help but feel like we were walking into a trap set by something far smarter than us. The restricted zone was quiet when we arrived, too quiet. Even the wind seemed to have stopped as we made our way toward the spot marked on my uncle's map. The canyon walls grew taller and narrower as we moved deeper into the maze-like terrain, until we finally reached an open clearing where ancient petroglyphs covered the rocks around us. "This is it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Linda nodded but didn't say anything. We began setting up for the ceremony, placing the herbs and powders around the clearing in patterns my uncle had shown us. The symbols felt familiar somehow, like they belonged here, as if they were part of the land itself. But as we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from just beyond the canyon walls. The shadows seemed darker now, and every sound echoed strangely through the narrow passages. Then came the voices, soft at first but growing louder with each passing moment. Derek. Linda. They sounded like people we knew, rangers from camp, friends from home, but there was something wrong about them, something hollow and empty. Linda looked at me with fear in her eyes. "It knows we're here." I nodded grimly as I finished, placing the last symbol on the ground. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to let us trap it without a fight. The canyon felt alive, but not in the way a forest or a meadow might. It was a different kind of alive, like the rocks themselves, were holding their breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. The air was thick, pressing down on us, and every sound seemed to echo too long, like the walls were whispering back. Linda and I stood in the clearing, surrounded by the symbols we'd drawn with the herbs and powders my uncle had given us. The petroglyphs on the canyon walls seemed to glow faintly in the fading light, though I couldn't tell if it was just a trick of my eyes or something else entirely. Then we heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and coming from somewhere behind us. I turned around, shining my flashlight into the shadows. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. No answer. The footsteps stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. "Derek." A voice called softly from the darkness. I froze. It wasn't just any voice, it was my uncle's. "Derek, it's me," it said again. "I came to help." Linda grabbed my arm. "Don't," she whispered urgently. "It's not him." I knew she was right. My uncle would never have followed us out here, not after everything he'd told me. But hearing his voice, it shook me in a way I wasn't prepared for. The voice grew louder, more insistent. "You need me, Derek. You can't do this alone." Then another voice joined in. This time, Linda's own voice, calling out from the opposite direction. "Help me," it said, soft and pleading. "Please." Linda's grip on my arm tightened as her face went pale. "That's not me," she whispered, her voice trembling. The thing was playing with us now, trying to break us down, and it was working. Suddenly, there was a rustling sound behind us. We spun around just in time to see someone, or something, step into the edge of the clearing. It looked like one of the missing students at first glance, but as it moved closer, I could see that its movements were wrong, jerky and unnatural, like it didn't quite know how to use its body. Its face was blank and expressionless at first, but then it changed. Its features shifted and twisted until it looked exactly like me. Linda gasped beside me as she stared at what could have been my reflection standing just a few feet away. "Derek," she whispered uncertainly. "It's not me," I said quickly, keeping my eyes locked on the thing in front of us. The creature tilted its head slightly and smiled, a cold, empty smile that sent chills down my spine. Then it spoke in my voice. "You can't stop me." Before I could react, it lunged forward with impossible speed. Linda screamed as I grabbed her arm and pulled her back toward the center of the clearing where we'd set up the symbols. The creature stopped just short of crossing the boundary we'd created with the herbs and powders. It hissed angrily, its face twisting into something monstrous. Its skin stretched too tight over its bones, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "It can't come in," Linda said breathlessly as she realized what had happened. I nodded, though I wasn't sure how long the barrier would hold. The creature paced around us like a predator circling its prey, its form shifting constantly. One moment it looked like me again. The next, it looked like Linda. Then it became someone else entirely. A face I didn't recognize but somehow felt familiar. And then, more of them appeared. One by one, figures emerged from the shadows around us, each one taking on a different shape. Rangers we worked with, hikers we'd seen before, even people I hadn't thought about in years. They all stood at the edge of the clearing, watching us with those same empty eyes and twisted smiles. "What is this?" Linda whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "It's not just one thing," I said quietly. "It's all of them." I remembered what my uncle had said. "It takes what it needs, your voice, your face, your memories, and leaves behind nothing but a shell." This wasn't just one skinwalker, it was something far worse. It had been feeding off this land for decades, maybe even centuries, and now it had grown strong enough to become many. The creatures began to move closer, testing the barrier we'd created. The air grew colder with each passing second, and I could feel something pressing against. My chest. A weight that made it hard to breathe. "We have to finish this," I said firmly, turning to Linda. "Now." She nodded quickly as we both knelt down to prepare for the ceremony my uncle had taught us. My hands shook as I lit the bundle of sage he'd given me and began chanting the words he'd written down. A prayer older than anything I'd ever known. The creatures hissed and shrieked as smoke filled the clearing, their forms flickering like shadows caught in a storm. But they didn't back away. They kept pushing closer, their faces twisting into shapes that didn't belong in this world. And then, one of them stepped through the barrier. It wasn't supposed to be possible, but somehow, it had found a way in. The moment the creature stepped through the barrier, time seemed to slow. Its movements were deliberate, almost mocking, as it crossed into the clearing. The others stayed just outside, watching with those hollow, empty eyes. I couldn't tell if they were waiting or if they were afraid of what might happen next. Linda gasped and stumbled back, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Derek, what do we do?" I didn't have an answer. My uncle's instructions had been clear. The symbols and herbs were supposed to keep it out. But this thing wasn't following any rules. It was stronger than we'd thought, smarter than we'd imagined. The creature stopped a few feet away from us, its form shifting again. One moment it looked like Linda. The next, it looked like me. And then it became something else entirely. A gaunt figure with a deer skull for a head and long, bony limbs that moved like smoke. Its voice came next, a mix of whispers and growls that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You think you can trap me," it said, its tone mocking. "I've been here longer than you've been alive, longer than your people have walked this land." I clenched my fists, trying to keep my fear in check. "You don't belong here," I said firmly, though my voice shook. "This isn't your land." The creature tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing as it studied me. "It was mine before it was yours," it hissed. "Before the tribes came, before the miners dug their holes, before you built your little parks." Linda grabbed my arm tightly, her nails digging into my skin. "Derek, it's getting closer." I nodded and reached for the pouch of herbs my uncle had given me. If the barrier wasn't enough, maybe the ritual itself would be stronger. I lit another bundle of sage and began chanting again, louder this time, forcing myself to focus on the words even as the creature moved closer. The smoke curled around us like a protective shield, but the thing didn't stop. It kept advancing, its twisted body moving in unnatural ways. "Your words are nothing," it growled. "Your prayers are dust." But as I continued chanting, something changed. The symbols on the ground began to glow faintly, their light spreading outward like ripples in water. The creature paused for a moment, its head jerking toward the glowing symbols as if it were confused or angry. Linda noticed, too. "It's working," she said urgently. "Keep going." I did just that, pouring every ounce of strength I had into the ritual. The smoke grew thicker, swirling around us as the thing moved faster now, its form flickering between shapes as it tried to break through my concentration. One moment it was my uncle. Then it was Linda. Then it was someone I hadn't seen in years. A soldier I'd served with in Vietnam, who hadn't made it home. "Derek," it whispered in his voice. A voice I hadn't heard in decades but still haunted me in my dreams. For a split second, I froze, the memories flooding back so fast that I couldn't breathe. But then, Linda's voice snapped me out of it. "Don't listen to it," she shouted desperately. "It's not real." She was right. None of this was real. Not the faces or voices or memories it was using against me. It was all a trick, a way to break me down and make me vulnerable. I gritted my teeth and forced myself to keep chanting, even as tears blurred my vision and fear clawed at my chest. The symbols flared brighter now, their light spreading across the clearing like fire. The creature shrieked again and recoiled slightly, but not enough to stop its attack. That's when I remembered what my uncle had said. don't trust anything you see or hear out there. If this thing fed on faces and voices, on memories, it meant one thing. It couldn't survive without them. I reached for my flashlight and aimed its beam directly at the creature's face, the deer skull that seemed to be its true form beneath all those stolen identities. "Show yourself," I shouted, angrily. "Stop hiding behind us." The light hit the skull dead on, and for a moment, everything stopped. The creature froze in place, its twisted body trembling as if it were struggling against something unseen. Then its form began to shift again, but this time, it didn't take on anyone's face or voice. It became something else entirely, something ancient and monstrous that didn't belong in this world. Its true form was horrifying. Gaunt limbs stretched too far, skin that looked like cracked earth, eyes that burned with unnatural light. But now that we could see it for what it really was, we could fight it. Linda grabbed another bundle of sage and lit it quickly while I continued chanting louder than ever before. The creature shrieked one last time, a sound so loud and terrible that it echoed through every canyon around us, before collapsing onto itself like smoke being sucked into a vacuum. And then, silence. The glowing symbols faded slowly, until they disappeared completely, leaving nothing but darkness behind. Linda collapsed onto her knees beside me, breathing heavily as tears streamed down her face. "Did we do it?" she asked shakily. I nodded slowly but didn't say anything. Not yet, because even though the creature was gone, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not yet. The canyon was quiet now, but it wasn't the comforting kind of quiet. It was the kind that felt wrong, like the land was holding its breath, waiting for something else to happen. Linda and I sat there for a long time, staring at the spot where the creature had disappeared. The air smelled of burnt sage and dust, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. "We stopped it," Linda said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Didn't we?" I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't. Something about the way the shadows moved in the corners of my vision told me this wasn't over. Not really. We packed up our gear and left the canyon as quickly as we could. Neither of us spoke much on the way back to camp, but I could tell Linda was just as shaken as I was. She kept glancing over her shoulder like she expected something to be following us. When we reached camp, the other rangers were waiting for us, their faces pale and tense. They'd heard the shrieking echo through the canyons and had seen strange lights flickering in the distance, but they didn't ask questions. Not right away. It was like they knew some things were better left unsaid. The official report we filed later claimed that toxic gas from the old uranium mines had caused hallucinations and confusion, an explanation that satisfied the park superintendent and kept the area closed off indefinitely. But Linda and I knew better. A week later, I visited my uncle again to tell him what had happened. He listened quietly as I described everything. The voices, the faces, the ceremony, and when I finished, he nodded slowly. "You did what you could," he said. "But things like that, they don't die. They wait." "What do you mean?" I asked. He looked at me with a seriousness that made my stomach tighten. "It's still out there," he said simply. "It's weaker now, but it'll find a way back. It always does." I left his house feeling heavier than ever, like I was carrying something I couldn't put down. A few days later, while hiking alone on a remote trail, I saw someone ahead of me, a man wearing a ranger uniform just like mine. At first, I thought it was one of my co-workers, but as I got closer, I froze. He turned around slowly and smiled, a smile that looked too familiar. It was me. And just like that, I knew this wasn't over. My name is Howard Thornton, but everyone calls me Howie. I'm a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, just like my father and grandfather before me. I've spent my entire life among these trees, these trails, and these streams. I know every bend in the river, every call of the birds, and every shadow cast by the towering old-growth forest. It's home. At least, it used to feel that way. It all started in the fall of 1991. The leaves were just beginning to turn, painting the mountains in fiery reds and golds. Normally, this is my favorite time of year. Cool mornings, crisp air, and the smell of wood smoke from nearby campgrounds. But that year, something felt off. A thick fog had settled over the park, heavier and denser than anything I'd seen before. It wasn't unusual for the Smokies to get foggy. It's part of their charm. But this was different. It clung to the ground like a living thing, moving against the wind as if it had a mind of its own. At first, I chalked it up to an odd weather pattern. But then, strange things started happening. A group of hikers was found wandering near Klingman's Dome, completely disoriented. They couldn't remember their names or where they were from. They just stared blankly ahead, like their minds had been wiped clean. We rushed them to the hospital in Gatlinburg, but even the doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with them. The next day, I was out on patrol with my camera. Photography's been a hobby of mine since my wife passed away 3 years ago. It helps me focus on something other than the ache in my chest. Anyway, I was snapping pictures of the fog rolling through the trees when I noticed something strange in one of the shots. At first glance, it looked like shadows. Long, stretched-out shapes at the edge of the frame. But when I zoomed in, they didn't look like shadows at all. They looked like figures, tall and thin, with antler-like shapes on their heads. I told myself it was just a trick of the light or maybe a smudge on the lens. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image from my camera kept replaying in my mind. Around midnight, I pulled out an old leather-bound journal that had belonged to my grandfather, a man who had worked these same trails as a ranger back in the 1930s and 40s. He used to tell me stories about the Watchers in the mist. When I was a kid, tall shadows that moved through the fog and watched from just beyond your line of sight. I always thought he was just trying to scare me into staying close to camp when we went hiking. But as I flipped through his journal that night, my blood ran cold. There it was, sketches of those same shadowy figures with antler-like heads. Notes scrawled in his shaky handwriting described how they only appeared during heavy fog and how people who encountered them often lost their memories or disappeared altogether. The next morning at work, things got worse. Another group of hikers had been found wandering aimlessly near Laurel Falls. Same blank stares, same loss of memory. And now there were reports coming in from local hospitals about an uptick in cases of rapid-onset dementia among older residents living near the park. Couldn't shake the feeling that everything was connected. The fog, the hikers, my grandfather's journal, and those shadowy figures in my photographs. I didn't know what I was dealing with yet, but one thing was clear. Something ancient and dangerous had awakened in these mountains, and it wasn't going away anytime soon. My mind was racing after those strange events in the park. I couldn't stop thinking about the fog, the hikers, and the figures in my grandfather's journal. It felt like I was piecing together a puzzle, but the edges were still blurry. I needed answers, and I knew where to start. My father, James Thornton, had been a park ranger too, just like his father before him. But now he was in a nursing home, his mind slipping away bit by bit. He'd been diagnosed with dementia a few years ago, and most days he didn't even recognize me. Still, something told me he might know something about this, something buried deep in his memories. I drove out to see him that afternoon. The nursing home was quiet, except for the occasional sound of a TV playing in one of the rooms. When I walked into my dad's room, he was sitting by the window staring out at the trees swaying in the breeze. His face looked tired, worn down by time and illness. "Hey, Dad," I said softly, sitting down beside him. He didn't respond at first, just kept looking out the window, but then his eyes shifted to me, and for a brief moment, it was like he recognized me. "Howie," he said, his voice shaky but clear. I nodded, surprised. "Yeah, Dad, it's me." He leaned closer, his expression suddenly serious. "They're back," he whispered. I froze. "What do you mean?" "The memory eaters," he said, his voice trembling. "They've always been here, watching, waiting." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Dad, what are you talking about?" He grabbed my arm with surprising strength for someone so frail. "Your grandfather tried to stop them. He mapped their movements, kept track of when they'd appear, but they're too strong, too old." I didn't know what to say. My dad hadn't been this lucid in years, and now he was talking about something that sounded straight out of a horror movie. "Where did Grandpa keep these maps?" I asked. "In the old cabin," he said weakly. "The one near Deep Creek." Nodded slowly. The cabin had been abandoned for decades. My grandfather used it as a base when he worked as a ranger back in the 30s and 40s. I hadn't been there since I was a kid. Before I could ask anything else, my dad's grip loosened, and his eyes glazed over again. He started mumbling to himself about trees and shadows and things I couldn't understand. Later that evening, I went back to the ranger station and started digging through old Park Service files. Most of them were routine stuff, trail closures, wildlife sightings, but then I found something tucked away in a locked drawer labeled Cognitive Displacement Incidents. It wasn't easy getting access to those files. I had to convince my supervisor it was related to recent events. Inside were reports dating back decades. Stories of hikers going missing during heavy fogs or being found wandering aimlessly with no memory of who they were or how they got there. There were even accounts from other rangers describing strange figures in the mist, tall shadows that seemed to move just out of sight. One report stood out. It was from 1973 and described an incident eerily similar to what was happening now. A group of researchers studying weather patterns near Klingman's Dome had disappeared during an unseasonable fog event. Their equipment was found scattered across the site, but there was no sign of them anywhere. The more I read, the more unsettled I became. This wasn't just some freak weather phenomenon. It had been happening for generations. I decided to head out to my grandfather's old cabin the next morning to see if I could find those maps my dad mentioned. Something told me they held the key to understanding what was going on. As I drove home that night through the winding mountain roads, the fog began creeping in again, thick and heavy like it had a life of its own. And for the first time in my life, these mountains didn't feel like home anymore. The next morning, I packed a bag with some supplies, flashlight, camera, notebook, and a thermos of coffee, and headed out to my grandfather's old cabin near Deep Creek. It was tucked away deep, in the woods, far from the main trails. Most people didn't even know it existed anymore. The drive was quiet, except for the hum of my truck's engine and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind picked up. The fog was still hanging low over the mountains, making everything feel muted and wrong. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked just like I remembered. Small, weathered, and half hidden by overgrown bushes. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and the smell of damp wood and mildew hit me immediately. Inside, everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. Old furniture sat exactly where it had been left decades ago, like time had just stopped here. I started searching through drawers and cabinets, looking for anything that might explain what my dad had told me. After about an hour of digging through old papers and faded photographs, I found a metal box tucked under a loose floorboard near the fireplace. Inside were maps, hand-drawn by my grandfather, and pages of notes written in his neat handwriting. The maps showed the park's trails, streams, and landmarks, but there were also strange markings scattered across them, circles and X's in places I didn't recognize. Next to each marking were dates going back as far as the 1920s. My grandfather had been tracking something that moved through the park at specific times. His notes were even more unsettling. He described fog, events where people went missing or were found in strange states of confusion. He wrote about seeing figures in the mist, shadowy shapes that looked like deer but walked upright on two legs. He called them the Dark Herd. One entry stood out. They come with the fog. They take what makes us who we are, our memories, our thoughts, and leave behind empty shells. They are not of this world. As I read those words, I felt a cold chill crawl up my spine. My grandfather had known about these things for years, and now they were back. I took pictures of everything with my camera before packing up the maps and notes to take back to the station. On my way out of the cabin, I noticed something strange. A faint trail leading into the woods behind the building. It wasn't marked on any map I'd seen before, but curiosity got the better of me. The trail wound through dense trees and thick underbrush until it opened up into a small clearing. In the center was an old stone marker covered in moss and vines. It looked like a grave marker, but there was no name or date on it, just strange carvings that didn't make any sense to me. I snapped a few photos before heading back to my truck. The whole area felt heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on me. Back at the ranger station later that day, I met with Dr. Monica Kaufman, a neurologist who had been called in to help with the hikers who'd been found catatonic in the park. Monica was sharp and no-nonsense, with a calm demeanor that made her easy to talk to. "I've been looking at their brain scans," she said as we sat in her makeshift office at the hospital. "It's like their minds have been wiped clean. No memories, no sense of self. But here's what's strange. All their brainwave patterns are identical." "Identical?" I asked. She nodded. "It's like whatever happened to them wasn't random. It was deliberate." I showed her some of my grandfather's notes and explained what I'd found at the cabin. At first, she seemed skeptical. Who wouldn't be? But when I showed her some of my photographs from the foggy areas of the park, her expression changed. "What are those?" she asked, pointing to one photo where faint shadowy shapes could be seen at the edge of the frame. "I don't know," I admitted, "but they're not normal." Monica leaned back in her chair, looking troubled. "If these things are real, if they're somehow feeding on people's minds, we need to figure out how they're doing it." Over the next few days, we worked together to piece things together. Monica ran blood tests on some of the victims and found traces of an unusual chemical compound, a type of fungal spore that seemed unique to this region of the forest. "That could explain how they're getting into people's systems," she said one night as we pored over her findings in my office. "But why now?" I asked. "Why is this happening again after all these years?" Monica didn't have an answer for that. Neither did I. A few days later, while reviewing some older photographs from around Klingman's Dome using different filters and techniques, Monica suggested. I saw them again, the Dark Herd. This time, they were clearer than before. Tall, shadow-like figures with antlered heads standing just beyond a group of hikers who'd gone missing weeks earlier. It felt like they were watching, waiting. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. A week after finding my grandfather's maps, the fog grew worse. It was everywhere now, thick and suffocating, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Calls were coming in from worried hikers and campers who were getting lost or disoriented. Some even claimed they heard strange noises in the woods, low, guttural sounds that didn't belong to any animal they could recognize. That's when we got the call about a missing child. A family camping near Cades Cove had reported their 6-year-old son, Tommy, missing. He'd wandered off into the trees while they were setting up camp, and they hadn't seen him since. My heart sank when I heard the news. A child lost in these woods was bad enough on a normal day, but with the fog, this thick, I didn't want to think about it. I grabbed my gear and joined the search party. There were 5 of us, me, 2 other rangers, and 2 volunteers from the local search and rescue team. We spread out in a line, calling Tommy's name as we moved. Deeper into the forest. The fog seemed to swallow our voices, making everything eerily quiet. About an hour into the search, I started noticing strange things. The air felt colder than it should have for this time of year. And the usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, leaves rustling, were completely gone. It was like the world had been muted. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, something dark shifting between the trees. I turned my head quickly, but there was nothing there. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, until I saw it again. This time, it was clearer. A tall, shadowy figure with what looked like antlers on its head. It moved, silently through the fog, its shape barely visible against the gray mist. My heart started pounding in my chest. "Tommy," I called out, my voice shaking slightly. "Are you out there?" No answer. I kept walking, my flashlight cutting through the fog in thin beams of light. That's when I heard it. A faint sound like whispering coming from up ahead. It wasn't words exactly, more like a low murmur that sent chills down my spine. I followed the sound until I reached a small clearing, and that's when I saw them. The dark herd. There were at least 5 of them, tall, shadow-like figures standing upright on 2 legs. Their bodies were thin and elongated, almost human-like but not quite right. Their heads were crowned with what looked like antlers or twisted branches. They moved slowly around a small figure sitting on the ground in the center of the clearing. It was Tommy. He was sitting cross-legged in the dirt, staring blankly ahead like he didn't even see me. Or them. The creatures circled him silently, their movements smooth and deliberate, like predators closing in on their prey. I froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. My instincts told me to run, to get as far away from this nightmare as possible, but I couldn't leave Tommy there. Taking a deep breath to steady myself, I raised my flashlight and aimed it at one of the creatures. The beam passed right through it. It didn't react at all, didn't even seem to notice me standing there. But as I stepped closer to Tommy, one of them turned its head toward me. Even though it didn't have eyes that I could see, I felt its gaze lock onto me like a weight pressing down on my chest. "Tommy," I said softly, trying not to panic. "It's okay. I'm here to help you." He didn't respond, didn't even blink. I reached out to grab his arm, but as soon as I touched him, a wave of dizziness hit me like a freight train. My vision blurred, and for a split second, it felt like my own memories were slipping away, like someone was reaching into my mind and pulling pieces out. I stumbled back, gasping for air as the creatures closed in around us. Desperate, I snapped a photo with my camera. It was all I could think to do, and then grabbed Tommy again with all my strength and pulled him away from them. The second my hand left his arm earlier must have broken whatever hold they had on me, because this time nothing happened. But Tommy remained limp and unresponsive, as if he wasn't even aware of what was going on. The creatures didn't follow us as we stumbled back toward where we'd started searching earlier. Instead, fading back into mist-like shadows, disappearing, entirely leaving behind only silence once again. When we finally made it back safely, Tommy physically seemed unharmed, but mentally, he remained catatonic, staring blankly ahead no matter how much his parents cried, begged, pleaded for him. Wake up, respond to anything. And deep down, something told me this wasn't over yet. Not by long shot. After the rescue, Tommy's blank stare haunted me. He was physically fine, but it was like his soul had been scooped out, leaving behind an empty shell. His parents cried and begged him to talk, but he didn't even blink. I couldn't help but feel responsible. I had seen those creatures, the dark herd, and I knew they had done something to him. But what? And why? Back at the ranger station, Monica and I sat in her makeshift lab, surrounded by her equipment and stacks of files. She was studying the blood samples taken from Tommy and the other victims who had been found catatonic in the park. "I found something," she said, breaking the silence. "There's a chemical compound in their bloodstreams that I've never seen before." "What kind of compound?" I asked. "It's fungal," she replied, holding up a slide under her microscope. "Spores, to be exact. But these spores are unique. They don't match anything in the databases." Fungal spores? I repeated, frowning. You think they're coming from the forest? Monica nodded. It makes sense. The old-growth forest here is ancient. Some of these trees have been around for hundreds of years. There could be fungi growing there that we've never encountered before. I thought about the fog, the way it clung to everything, thick and unnatural, and how it always seemed to appear before someone went missing or turned up catatonic. Do you think the fog is carrying the spores? I asked. It's possible, she said. But there's more to this than just spores. Something is triggering these events. Something bigger. That night, I pored over my grandfather's maps and notes again, trying to make sense of the markings he had made across the park. The settlement cemetery near Deep Creek kept coming up in his entries, along with stories of a wasting illness that had struck early settlers in the area. I decided to dig into the park's historical records to see if there was any connection. What I found sent shivers down my spine. In the 1800s, before the land became a national park, there had been a small community living near Deep Creek. According to old accounts, many of the settlers fell ill with a mysterious sickness that left them weak and confused before they eventually died. Locals called it the hollowing. Some believed it was caused by bad water or poor nutrition, but others whispered about something darker, spirits in the woods that drained people's life force. I also found references to Appalachian folklore about hollow men, figures who wandered the forest at night, empty and lost because they had made deals with spirits that went wrong. The stories claimed these spirits demanded sacrifices, human sacrifices, to keep them at bay. The pieces were starting to fit together. The fog, the fungal spores, the disappearances, and now these old tales of hollow men and sacrifices. It all seemed to center around that cemetery near Deep Creek. The next day, Monica and I decided to visit the cemetery ourselves. It wasn't an official park site, just a forgotten patch of land overgrown with weeds and surrounded by towering trees. Most people didn't even know it existed. As we walked through the forest toward the cemetery, Monica stopped suddenly and pointed at a tree trunk covered in strange markings, patterns etched into the bark that looked almost like symbols. "What do you think these are?" she asked. I shook my head. I've never seen anything like them before. We took pictures of the symbols and kept moving until we reached the cemetery. It was just as eerie as I'd imagined. Rows of crumbling headstones leaning at odd angles, some so weathered you couldn't read the names anymore. At the center of the cemetery was a larger stone marker with carvings similar to those we'd seen on the tree trunk. Monica ran her fingers over them thoughtfully. "These don't look random," she said quietly. "They're deliberate, like someone was trying to leave a message." As we stood there in silence, a sudden gust of wind blew through the trees, carrying with it a faint whispering sound that made my skin crawl. "Do you hear that?" Monica asked nervously. I nodded, gripping my flashlight tightly even though it was still daylight. We didn't stay long after that. Something about that place felt wrong, like we were being watched. Back at the station later that evening, Monica compared our photos of the carvings to some old books on Appalachian folklore she had brought with her. One symbol kept coming up, a spiral shape surrounded by jagged lines. "This symbol represents a barrier," she explained. "It's supposed to trap spirits or keep them contained." I stared at her in disbelief. "You're saying someone tried to trap these things here?" "It's possible," she said grimly. "But if they're getting out now, something must have broken." Her words sent a chill through me as I thought about Tommy and all the others who had been affected by whatever was lurking in these mountains. The fog wasn't just weather. It was something alive, something ancient, and it wasn't going away anytime soon. The next morning, Monica and I sat in my office, staring at the photos of the carvings we'd found at the cemetery. The spiral symbol kept drawing my attention, like it was trying to tell me something. Monica was flipping through one of her books on Appalachian folklore, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This symbol," she said, tapping the photo with her finger. "It's not just a barrier. In some stories, it's also used as an offering site. An offering site? I repeated, feeling a knot form in my stomach. She nodded. The old legends talk about settlers who made sacrifices to the spirits in the forest. Human sacrifices. They believed it would keep the spirits from taking their families or destroying their crops. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what she was saying. You're telling me those people actually sacrificed each other to keep these things away? Monica hesitated before answering. I don't know if it's true or just folklore, but what if they were desperate? What if they thought it was the only way to survive? Her words hung heavy in the air. I didn't want to believe it, but after everything I'd seen, the fog, the dark herd, Tommy's blank stare, it didn't seem so far-fetched anymore. Later, that day, we were called into a meeting with Superintendent Larson, the head of the park. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy, always focused on keeping things running smoothly and avoiding bad press. But when we told him what we'd found, the fungal spores, the carvings, the connection to the cemetery, his reaction surprised me. He didn't look shocked or confused. He looked resigned. I was hoping it wouldn't come to this, he said quietly. What do you mean? I asked. Larson sighed and leaned forward in his chair. This isn't the first time we've dealt with something like this, he admitted. There have been incidents in the past. You knew? Monica asked, her voice sharp with disbelief. Larson nodded. We've known for years. The fog, the disappearances, it's all part of a pattern that goes back decades, maybe even longer. Then why hasn't anyone done anything about it? I demanded. We have, Larson said firmly. We've contained it as best we can. But this isn't something you can just get rid of. It's part of this place, part of these mountains. His words sent a chill through me. What do you mean by contained? Larson hesitated before answering. Sometimes, sacrifices have to be made. I stared at him in disbelief. You're saying you've been feeding people to these things? Not people, he said quickly. Animals, mostly. But there have been times when... He trailed off, unable to finish his sentence. Monica stood up abruptly, her face pale with anger. You're talking about human lives like they're bargaining chips. How can you justify that? Larson looked at her calmly. Because if we don't, more people will die. That evening, Monica and I sat outside the station, trying to make sense of everything we'd learned. The fog had started rolling in again, thick and heavy like always. We can't let this keep happening, Monica said firmly. There has to be another way. I nodded, but didn't say anything. My mind was racing with thoughts of my grandfather's, maps and notes. The patterns he'd tracked and the warnings he'd written down so many years ago. As we sat there in silence, Larson appeared out of nowhere, his face grim. I need your help, he said simply. With what? I asked warily. There's been another incident, he said. A group of hikers went missing near Deep Creek this afternoon. My heart sank. Deep Creek again. That cursed place where everything seemed to lead back to. We'll help, I said reluctantly, standing up and grabbing my gear. When we arrived at Deep Creek, the fog was so thick you could barely see your own hand in front of your face. Larson led us toward the cemetery without saying much, his flashlight cutting weakly through the mist. As we approached the clearing where the cemetery lay hidden among the trees, Monica suddenly stopped and grabbed my arm. Where are the other rangers? She whispered. I looked around and realized she was right. There was no one else there except for us and Larson. Before I could say anything, Larson turned to face us with a strange look in his eyes. Calm, but cold. I'm sorry, he said quietly. What are you talking about? I asked, my voice rising with panic. It has to be done, he said simply. The fog is spreading too fast this time. If we don't act now... He didn't finish his sentence because Monica suddenly bolted toward the trees. But Larson was faster than he looked for a man his age. He grabbed her arm and dragged her back toward the cemetery as she screamed and fought against him. "Let her go," I shouted, rushing toward them. But before I could reach them, something moved in the fog behind Larson. It was one of them, the dark herd. It stepped out of the mist silently, its tall, shadowy form towering over us all like some kind of ancient predator. And then another appeared, and another, until they were all around us. Larson let go of Monica and stepped back slowly toward me as if realizing too late that his plan had gone horribly wrong. "They're here," he whispered hoarsely, and, for once, he sounded genuinely afraid. The fog was alive. It swirled and pulsed around us, thick and suffocating, as if it had a purpose. The dark herd emerged one by one from the mist, their tall, shadowy forms moving with an unnatural grace, their antlered heads tilted slightly as if they were studying us. There were at least a dozen of them now, encircling the cemetery. Larson froze beside me, his face pale and his breathing shallow. Monica stood a few feet away, clutching her flashlight like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. None of us spoke. None of us moved. I don't know what I expected the dark herd to do. Charge at us, maybe, or vanish back into the fog, but they just stood there, silent and still. It was almost worse than if they'd attacked. "What do we do?" Monica whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. My mind was racing, trying to remember everything I'd read in my grandfather's notes. The spiral symbol, the carvings, the sacrifices. There had to be something we could do to stop this. Larson suddenly stepped forward, raising his hands, as if in surrender. "Take me," he said loudly, his voice echoing in the stillness. "If that's what you want, take me." "Larson, no," I shouted, but he ignored me. One of the creatures tilted its head toward him, and for a moment I thought it might actually accept his offer. But then it turned away and looked directly at me instead. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me as its gaze locked onto mine. I couldn't see its eyes, if it even had any, but I could feel its attention like a weight pressing down on my chest. "They don't want him," Monica said softly from behind me. "They want you." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. She was right. The dark herd wasn't interested in Larson or Monica. They were focused on me. Maybe it was because of my connection to my grandfather, or because I'd been digging into their history. Either way, I knew there was no running from this. "Fine," I said through gritted teeth, stepping forward. "You want me? Then take me." "Howie, no!" Monica cried out, grabbing my arm. "It's the only way," I told her quietly. "If I don't do this, they'll keep coming after everyone else." She shook her head fiercely, tears streaming down her face. "There has to be another way." But deep down, I knew there wasn't. I stepped closer to the center of the clearing where the largest of the dark herds stood waiting. As I approached, I felt a strange sensation wash over me, like my thoughts were being pulled apart piece by piece. Memories of my childhood flashed before my eyes. Hiking with my dad in these very woods, sitting by the campfire with my grandfather as he told stories about the mountains, holding my wife's hand in the hospital as she took her last breath. The memories felt fragile now, like they could crumble into dust at any moment. I reached into my bag and pulled out my camera, the same one I'd used to capture those eerie photos of the fog weeks ago. If these things fed on memories and consciousness, maybe there was a way to fight back using what they feared most: being seen. I raised the camera and snapped a photo of the creature closest to me. The flash lit up the fog for a brief second, and for that moment I saw it clearly. Its twisted form frozen in time like an image burned into my mind. The creature recoiled slightly at the flash but didn't retreat entirely. Encouraged by its reaction, I took another photo, and another, each time forcing them to reveal themselves more fully. The other creatures began shifting uneasily in response to the light from the camera flashes. They didn't like being exposed. It was as if their power came from staying hidden in the shadows. Monica caught on quickly and grabbed her phone's flashlight, shining it directly at one of them. The creature flinched and stepped back into the fog. "It's working!" she shouted over her shoulder. Larson joined in too, using his flashlight to drive back another one of the creatures that had been inching closer to him. As we fought back, with light and cameras, I noticed something strange happening near the large stone marker in the center of the cemetery. The spiral carvings began glowing faintly, pulsing in time with each flash of light we used against the creatures. The realization hit me like lightning. This wasn't just a grave marker, it was some kind of seal or trap meant to contain these things. "Monica!" I yelled over the chaos. "The marker! Focus your light on it!" She nodded and aimed her flashlight directly at the carvings while Larson and I continued driving back the creatures with our own lights and cameras. The glow from the spiral grew, brighter and brighter until it was almost blinding. The dark herd began retreating into the fog one by one as if being pulled away by some invisible force. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes, they were gone. The fog began to thin out too until we could see clear skies above us for the first time in weeks. We stood there in stunned silence for a long moment before Larson finally spoke up. "What just happened?" "I think," Monica said slowly, still staring at the glowing marker. "I think we sealed them back inside. For now," I added grimly. "Deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Not really." The fog lifted slowly, like a curtain being pulled back to reveal the forest's true face. For the first time in weeks, I could see the stars above us, glittering faintly through the gaps in the trees. The air felt lighter, less oppressive, but the silence remained, heavy and unnatural. Monica lowered her flashlight, her hands trembling. Larson stood frozen near the cemetery's edge, his face pale and his eyes wide with disbelief. None of us spoke right away. We were too stunned by what had just happened. I walked over to the stone marker at the center of the cemetery. The spiral carvings had stopped glowing, but they still seemed alive somehow, like they were humming faintly beneath my fingertips when I touched them. Whatever power had been holding the dark herd at bay for all these years was active again. For now. "Do you think it's over?" Monica asked quietly, breaking the silence. I shook my head. "I don't know. Maybe for a while. But I don't think they're gone for good." She nodded slowly, her expression grim. "We need to tell someone about this. Someone who can help." Larson finally spoke up, his voice hoarse and shaky. "No one can help," he muttered. "The government tried back in the 70s. They studied this place for years and couldn't stop it. They just buried it under paperwork and hoped it wouldn't come back." I stared at him, anger bubbling up inside me. "You knew about this all along and didn't warn anyone? You let people walk into this park without knowing what was out here?" Larson didn't answer. He just looked down at the ground like he couldn't bear to meet my eyes. When we got back to the ranger station later that night, Monica and I reviewed everything we'd collected. The photos of the dark herd, the carvings at the cemetery, my grandfather's maps and notes. It was overwhelming, but we knew we couldn't keep it to ourselves. The next morning, government agents arrived at the park. Men in suits who didn't introduce themselves or explain why they were there. Larson had called them after we returned from Deep Creek, claiming it was protocol. They confiscated everything. My camera, Monica's research files, even my grandfather's journal, and ordered us not to speak about what had happened. "It's for your own safety," one of them said coldly as they packed up their equipment. I wanted to argue, but what could I say? Who would believe us if we told them about shadow creatures that fed on memories and fog that could swallow people whole? In the days that followed, life in the park seemed to return to normal, or as normal as it could be after what we'd seen. The fog was gone and hikers started returning to the trails again. But there were signs that something wasn't quite right. Patches of dead vegetation appeared in random spots throughout the forest, places where nothing seemed to grow anymore. Animals avoided certain areas near Deep Creek as if they could sense something humans couldn't. And then there was Tommy. He never recovered from his encounter with the dark herd. His parents took him home eventually, but he remained catatonic, alive, but empty, like a shell of who he used to be. I tried to move on after that, to focus on my work and pretend everything was fine, but it wasn't easy. Sometimes I'd catch myself staring at old photo albums from my hikes through the park over the years, only to find blank spots where certain pictures should have been. Memories I knew I'd captured but couldn't seem to recall anymore. It was like pieces of me were missing, taken by something I couldn't fight or understand. One evening as I walked through the forest alone, camera slung over my shoulder like always, I stopped near a stream and looked out at the mountains in the distance. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the trees. For a moment, I thought I saw movement in those shadows. Tall figures with antlered heads watching from just beyond my line of sight. I blinked, and they were gone. But deep down, I knew they were still out there, waiting, watching, and someday they'd come back again. My name is Gabriel Cortez, but most people just call me Gabe. I'm a park ranger here at Everglades National Park in Florida. I've been working here for a few years now, after leaving the Coast Guard. Back then, I was a rescue diver. It was my job to pull people out of the water when things went wrong. But sometimes you can't save everyone. There was this one mission, one that still haunts me. A family trapped on a sinking boat during a storm. I got the father and daughter out, but the mother, I couldn't reach her in time. She was right there, just inches away, and then she was gone. After that, I couldn't do it anymore. The water stopped feeling like home and started feeling like something else, something dangerous. So I came here to the Everglades hoping to find some peace. It's quiet out here most of the time, just me and the wetlands. The airboats hum as they glide over the water, and the cypress trees stretch their roots deep into the earth like they've been here forever. It's beautiful in its own way, but also eerie. The Everglades have secrets, things hidden beneath the surface that most people never see. This year has been different, though. We're in the middle of a historic drought, and parts of the park that are usually underwater have dried up completely. It's strange seeing places that have been submerged for decades suddenly exposed to sunlight. Old structures have started to appear, ruins of buildings no one remembers, pieces of history buried by time and water. A few weeks ago, I noticed something odd while patrolling a remote area of the park. The water there was unusually clear, almost like glass. That's not normal for the Everglades. It's usually murky and full of life, fish, algae, plants, but this spot felt empty, quiet in a way that made my skin crawl. I decided to take a closer look and found something I wasn't expecting. Ruins of what looked like an old research facility submerged in the water. The walls were covered in algae and barnacles, but you could still make out parts of it. A broken sign with faded letters and shattered windows staring up at me like hollow eyes. Inside one of the buildings, I found something even stranger, a waterproof journal sealed in a metal box. The cover had a date stamped on it, 1943. The pages were brittle, but still readable. They talked about specimens being studied here, something about aquatic anomalies found deep in the Everglades. During World War II, I didn't know what to make of it at first. It sounded like some kind of military experiment or maybe just wild theories from scientists who spent too much time alone in the swamp. But then people started drowning. It didn't make sense at first. These weren't accidents like you'd expect from tourists who don't know how to swim or get too close to alligators. These were strong swimmers, people who knew what they were doing out here, and yet they were found floating face down in shallow water with no clear cause. Campers started reporting strange noises at night, singing coming from somewhere near the water's edge. One family said they heard voices calling their names, but when they went outside to check, no one was there. I don't know what's happening out here, but I can feel it. It's like the swamp is waking up after being asleep for a long time. And whatever's beneath these still waters, it isn't friendly. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The drownings, the strange singing, the clear water, it all felt connected somehow. So, I started digging. I spent my evenings at the local library and talking to anyone who'd been around the Everglades long enough to know its stories. What I found only made things worse. The first clue came from an old newspaper article I found in the archives. It was dated 1943, the same year as the journal I'd found in the ruins. The article talked about a cluster of mysterious drownings in a small community near the park. The victims were all strong swimmers, just like the ones now. Locals called it the curse of the water children. At first, I thought it was just folklore, but then I noticed something chilling. These drowning clusters seemed to happen every 35 years. 1943, 1978, and now here we were. The deeper I looked, the stranger it got. There were stories from indigenous communities who'd lived here long before settlers arrived. They talked about creatures they called water children, beings that lived in the swamps and only came out when disturbed. According to their legends, these creatures could mimic human voices and lure people into the water. Once you heard their song, it was already too late. I met an old man named Henry who'd lived near the Everglades his whole life. He was in his 80s, but still sharp as a tack. When I asked him about the drownings, he just shook his head and said, "You're stirring up things that should stay buried." He told me about a night when he was a boy, how he saw people who weren't people crawling out of a pond near his family's farm. Their skin was pale and shiny, like fish scales, and their eyes didn't look human. His father had told him never to go near that pond again, and he never did. Then there was the sugar plantation. Back in the 1800s, this area was home to one of Florida's largest plantations. The owners used enslaved people to work the fields, and there were rumors of workers disappearing near certain pools of water on the property. Some believed they ran away. Others whispered that something in the water took them. But what really made my stomach turn was what I found about World War II. During that time, parts of the Everglades were closed off for military use, something about testing new equipment for underwater warfare. There were rumors of experiments involving aquatic anomalies, though no one seemed to know exactly what that meant. I couldn't help but think about that journal I'd found in the ruins, the one talking about specimens being studied. What if those experiments had uncovered something they shouldn't have? Something ancient? Something that had been sleeping beneath these waters for centuries? The more I learned, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't just history. It was a pattern. Every 35 years this thing, whatever it was, came back. And now it was happening again. One night, while I was going through my notes at home, I heard something outside my window. A faint humming sound, almost like someone singing far away. My house is on stilts near one of the canals, so it's not unusual to hear animals or even tourists passing by on boats late at night. But this was different. I turned off my lamp and stepped outside onto the porch with my flashlight. The air was heavy with humidity, and everything was still. Too still. No crickets chirping, no frogs croaking, just silence. And that humming sound. I shined my flashlight toward the water, but didn't see anything at first. Then I noticed ripples moving across the surface, slow and deliberate, like something big was just beneath it. "Hello," I called out, even though I knew no one would answer. The humming stopped. For a moment, all I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then there was a splash, loud enough to make me jump, and whatever it was disappeared into the darkness. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I couldn't shake what I'd seen or heard. I decided to bring someone else into this. Dr. Lydia Hammond was a marine biologist who had been working in the park for a few months, studying water quality and the effects of the drought on local wildlife. She was sharp, no nonsense, and didn't scare easily. If anyone could help me figure out what was going on, it was her. I told her about the clear water, the drownings, and the strange singing. At first, she looked at me like I was crazy, but when I showed her the journal and explained the pattern of drownings every 35 years, she started to take me seriously. "I've seen some unusual readings in my water samples," she said, flipping through her notebook. "There's a protein marker that doesn't match anything I've seen before. It's almost like something biological is leaching into the water." We decided to investigate the area where I'd found the ruins. Lydia brought her equipment, sonar, water testing kits, and an underwater camera. As we approached the site, on my airboat, the water was just as clear as before, but now it felt even more unsettling. The sunlight reflected off the surface like a mirror, and everything below seemed frozen in time. Lydia dropped her sonar into the water and watched the readings on her monitor. At first, it showed nothing unusual, just fish and debris. But then something moved. A large shape appeared on the screen, walking upright beneath us. "Is that?" Lydia started to ask, but didn't finish. I leaned over to look at the monitor. The shape was humanoid. 2 arms, 2 legs, but it wasn't human. It moved slowly, almost deliberately, before disappearing off the edge of the screen. "Let's get out of here," I said quickly. But Lydia wasn't ready to leave yet. She lowered her underwater camera into the water and adjusted its angle, until we could see what was below us. At first, it was just rocks and plants, normal swamp stuff, but then something shifted in the corner of the frame. It was hard to make out at first. A pale figure crouched in the mud with its back turned toward us. Its skin looked translucent, almost glowing under the camera's light. Then it turned its head toward us. Its face wasn't human. Lydia yanked the camera out of the water so fast she nearly dropped it. "What was that?" she whispered. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking. We didn't stick around after that. On our way back to park headquarters, Lydia kept staring at her monitor like she couldn't believe what she'd seen. "This isn't normal," she said finally. "Whatever's down there, it's not supposed to be." That night, things got worse. A group of tourists went missing near one of the mangrove tunnels. A family of 4 who had rented a boat for an evening ride. When we found their boat early the next morning, it was empty except for a few personal belongings scattered across the deck. Sunglasses, a backpack, and a child's stuffed animal soaked with water. We searched for hours but only found one survivor, a man in his 40s who had been clinging to a piece of driftwood near shore. He was barely conscious when we pulled him out of the water, his skin pale and clammy like he'd been floating there for days instead of hours. When he finally came to at the hospital, he couldn't remember much, just flashes of things he couldn't explain. "There were people in the water," he said weakly. "They were singing, calling us, but they weren't people." I wanted to believe he was just delirious from shock or dehydration, but deep down I knew he wasn't lying. Later that week, Junior Ranger Peter Wilkins disappeared while collecting water samples near one of the canals. He was only 19, a good kid who loved working in the park and never missed a shift. When we found his equipment abandoned on shore with no sign of him anywhere nearby, my stomach dropped. That night during patrols, I heard it again, the humming sound from before. But this time it was louder and closer than ever. It felt like it was coming from all around me, echoing through the mangroves like a chorus of voices blending together. I gripped my flashlight tightly as I scanned the water's edge for any movement. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a pale figure slipping silently into one of the tunnels. But when I ran toward it with my light shining ahead of me, there was nothing there. The swamp felt alive that night. Not with animals or insects, but with something else entirely. Something watching me from just beneath its surface. The day after Peter disappeared, the park felt different. The air was heavier, like the swamp itself was holding its breath. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about how I'd just seen him the day before, joking about how he'd finally learned to steer the airboat without getting stuck in the mud. And now he was gone, just like that. We organized a search party. Rangers, volunteers, even a few locals joined in, combing through the mangroves and canals. We found his boat overturned in a shallow pool with claw marks scratched into the metal hull. It didn't make sense. There aren't any animals in the Everglades that could do that. Not gators, not panthers, nothing. As we spread out to search on foot, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I looked, over my shoulder, I thought I saw movement, just a flicker of something pale slipping between the trees. But when I turned my flashlight on it, there was nothing there. By sunset, we still hadn't found Peter. Most of the group decided to call it for the night and try again in the morning, but I couldn't leave. Something was keeping me there. Something pulling me toward the water. I was standing near one of the deeper pools when I heard it again. Singing. It was soft at first, almost like a lullaby floating on the breeze. But as I listened closer, I realized it wasn't just one voice, it was many, blending together in perfect harmony. I should have turned around and left right then and there, but instead, I stepped closer to the water's edge. The singing grew louder, more beautiful, and for a moment it felt like everything else faded away. The fear, the exhaustion, even my own thoughts. All I could hear was that song. Then something broke through the surface of the water. It was a hand, pale and webbed, with long fingers that reached toward me like they were trying to pull me in. I stumbled back just as another figure rose from the pool, a humanoid shape with translucent skin that shimmered in the moonlight. Its eyes were black and empty, like two bottomless pits staring straight into my soul. I scrambled backward as more of them emerged from the water. 5, maybe 6 of them, moving together like a pack of wolves closing in on their prey. Their mouths opened as they sang that haunting melody, and for a moment I felt myself leaning forward again, drawn to them despite every instinct screaming at me to run. Then someone grabbed my arm and yanked me back. It was Lydia. She'd been searching nearby and heard me shouting, or maybe she heard them singing too. Either way, she pulled me away from the water just as one of those things lunged toward us with impossible speed. We ran as fast as we could, through the mangroves, tripping over roots and splashing through shallow pools until we reached my airboat. The creatures didn't follow us onto land. They just stood there at the water's edge, watching us with those empty black eyes as we sped away into the night. Back at headquarters, Lydia and I tried to make sense of what had happened. She'd seen them too. There was no denying it now. They're not just animals, she said quietly. They're something else. I told her about what Henry had said, the stories about water children and people disappearing near certain pools. She nodded like it all made sense now, but didn't say anything more. The next morning, things escalated again. A group of tourists went missing near one of the park's popular fishing spots. A father and his 2 teenage sons who had been out on a small boat. Their empty vessel was found drifting near some mangroves, later that afternoon with no sign of them anywhere nearby. When we searched their last known location, we found something chilling. Pearl-like sacks clinging to the roots of a cypress tree near where their boat had been found. They were translucent and filled with some kind of dark liquid that pulsed faintly under the sunlight. Lydia took one back to her lab for analysis while I stayed behind to continue searching for any sign of the missing family. As night fell again, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of time, that whatever these things were planning was only just beginning. That night during patrols, I heard their song again, this time louder than ever before. It echoed through every canal and tunnel like it was coming from all directions at once. And then, silence. It was worse than the singing somehow, like they were waiting for something or someone to make a move first. I gripped my flashlight tightly as I scanned my surroundings for any sign of movement, but saw nothing but shadows stretching across still waters under an eerie moonlit sky. Whatever was happening out here wasn't over, not by a long shot, and Deep down, I knew this was only going to get worse before it got better, if it ever got better at all. After everything that had happened, the missing tourists, Peter's disappearance, the creatures we'd seen, I knew we needed answers. Lydia was working late in her lab trying to figure out what those pearl-like sacs were, but I couldn't sit still. I kept thinking about the journal I'd found and the experiments it mentioned. There had to be someone who knew more. That's when I remembered Dr. Harrison Wells. I'd come across his name while researching the Navy's presence in the Everglades during World War II. He was a retired scientist who had worked on classified projects involving aquatic anomalies. Most of his colleagues were long gone, but Wells was still alive, living in a small house about an hour outside the park. I didn't know if he'd talk to me, but I had to try. When I knocked on his door, it took a while for him to answer. He was an older man, probably in his late 70s, with sharp eyes that seemed to size me up the moment he saw me. "You're not here for small talk," he said flatly. I told him about the journal, the drownings, and the creatures Lydia and I had seen. For a long time, he didn't say anything. He just stared at me like he was deciding whether or not to trust me. Finally, he sighed and motioned for me to come inside. His house was cluttered with old books and papers, most of them yellowed with age. He sat down heavily in a worn armchair and rubbed his temples before speaking. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he said. "Those things, they're older than you can imagine." He told me about how the Navy had stumbled upon them during the war while testing underwater equipment in remote parts of the Everglades. At first, they thought they'd discovered a new species, something unique to the swamp. But it quickly became clear that these creatures weren't ordinary animals. "They're intelligent," Wells said. "They hunt in packs, communicate with each other, and their singing, it's not just noise, it's how they lure their prey." According to Wells, the Navy tried to study them, capture them even, but it didn't go well. The creatures were incredibly strong and could survive for decades buried in mud without food or water. When disturbed, they became aggressive and started targeting anyone who got too close. "They reproduce by infecting humans," Wells explained. "Those pearl-like sacs you found, they're eggs. Once they hatch, they transform their host into one of them." I felt my stomach turn as he spoke. "You mean people turn into those things?" Wells nodded grimly. "It starts slow, changes in skin texture, sensitivity to light, webbing between fingers and toes. But once it begins, there's no stopping. I thought about Peter, about the tourists we hadn't found, about Lydia working alone in her lab with one of those sacs sitting on her desk. "What does the government know about this?" I asked. "They know enough to stay out of it," Wells said bitterly. "After the war ended, they abandoned the project and sealed off most of their research sites. They figured if they left the creatures alone, they'd stay dormant. But they didn't," I said quietly. "No," Wells agreed. "Something woke them up." He didn't have an answer for why they were active again now, or why their appearances seemed tied to cycles of drought, but he did tell me one thing that gave me hope. Sound frequencies could disrupt their coordination. "We discovered it by accident during testing," he said. "Certain frequencies mess with their ability to communicate and hunt effectively." Before I left, Wells handed me an old Navy report detailing their experiments with sound waves. It wasn't much, just a few pages of technical jargon, but it was better than nothing. As I drove back to the park that night, my mind raced with everything Wells had told me. These creatures weren't just animals. They were something ancient and dangerous that had been lurking beneath the surface for centuries. And now, they were awake. When I got back to the park, I went straight to Lydia's lab. I was worried about her. Worried about what Wells had said about those sacs and how they could infect people. I knocked on the door, but she didn't answer. The lights were on though, so I let myself in. She was sitting at her desk, staring at the sac she'd brought back from the swamp. It was sitting in a glass container, pulsing faintly like it was alive. "Lydia," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "We need to talk." She turned to look at me, and that's when I noticed something was wrong. Her skin looked pale, almost translucent under the fluorescent lights, and there was a faint webbing between her fingers. "I think it's already started," she whispered. My chest tightened. "What are you talking about?" She held up her hand, showing me the webbing. "I thought it was just a reaction to the water, something temporary, but it's getting worse." I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. Wells had warned me about this, about how the transformation started slow but couldn't be stopped once it began. Lydia must have been exposed when she handled the sack. "We'll figure this out," I said quickly, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Wells told me about sound frequencies. They can disrupt the creature's coordination. Maybe we can use that to stop them." Lydia nodded weakly but didn't say anything. She looked exhausted, like she was fighting something inside her that she couldn't control. That night, a hurricane warning was issued for the area. It wasn't unusual for this time of year, but it couldn't have come at a worse time. The storm would flood parts of the park that were already vulnerable and give the creatures even more room to move inland. We spent the next day evacuating campers and closing off sections of the park. Most people didn't ask questions. They just packed up and left, but a few tourists complained about losing their vacation plans. If only they knew what we were really dealing with. By the time the storm hit, the park was eerily empty. The wind howled through the mangroves, bending trees until they looked like they might snap in half. Rain poured down in sheets, flooding roads and turning trails into rivers. I stayed behind with Lydia to monitor the situation from headquarters. We'd rigged one of my airboats with modified engines designed to emit low-frequency sound waves, the kind Wells said would disrupt the creature's hunting patterns. It wasn't much, but it was all we had. As night fell, we started hearing reports of strange activity near some of the flooded areas. People seeing figures moving through the water or hearing singing that seemed to come from nowhere. One ranger called in saying he'd seen something crawl out of a canal and disappear into an irrigation ditch. "They're moving inland," Lydia said quietly. I grabbed my gear and headed for the airboat. Lydia wanted to come with me, but I told her to stay behind. It wasn't safe for her out there, especially now that she was showing signs of transformation. The storm made navigating through the flooded park almost impossible. Water levels were rising fast, swallowing trails and turning familiar landmarks into unrecognizable islands. The modified engines hummed as I steered through the mangroves, sending out sound waves that echoed through the swamp like a low rumble. At first, it seemed like nothing was happening, just rain and wind battering against me. But then I saw them. The creatures were everywhere, emerging from pools of water, crawling through flooded tunnels, and slipping silently between trees, like shadows come to life. Their translucent skin glowed faintly under flashes of lightning, making them look even more otherworldly. They moved in packs, coordinating their movements as they closed in on me from all sides. But as soon as they got close enough to hear the sound waves from my engine, they hesitated. Some of them froze completely. Others turned away and disappeared back into the water. It was working, but barely. I pushed forward toward one of their nests, a large pool surrounded by cypress trees where Wells had said they might be breeding. The water here was colder than anywhere else in the park and felt almost alive with movement beneath its surface. As I approached, one of them lunged at me from behind a tree, grabbing onto my arm with its webbed hands. Its grip was impossibly strong, pulling me toward the water as its black eyes stared into mine. I fought back with everything I had, kicking, punching, but it wouldn't let go until another blast of sound waves hit it directly. It screeched, a high-pitched noise that made my ears ring, and released me before disappearing into the darkness. By the time I reached their nest, I was soaked and shaking, but still determined to finish what I'd started. The nest was worse than I imagined. It wasn't just a pool of water. It was a massive, sunken pit surrounded by twisted cypress roots and thick mud. The water was unnaturally cold, and the air smelled like something rotten. Floating near the edges were dozens of those pearl-like sacks, pulsing faintly like they were alive. Some of them had already burst open, spilling dark liquid into the water. I gripped the throttle of the airboat tightly, my heart pounding as I steered closer. The modified engines were still emitting sound waves, but I could see the creatures gathering around the nest, watching me from the shadows. There were so many of them, more than I'd ever seen before. Their translucent skin shimmered like wet glass under flashes of lightning, and their black eyes followed my every move. I knew I couldn't fight them all. The only chance I had was to destroy the nest and hope it would stop them from spreading further inland. I reached for the canister of fuel I'd brought with me and started pouring it into the water around the nest. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to focus. The creatures didn't move at first. They just watched me like they were waiting for something. Then one of them stepped forward. It looked different from the others. Taller, with darker skin that seemed almost human. Its movements were slower, more deliberate, and its eyes weren't empty like the others. They were sharp and intelligent, filled with something that felt like anger. It opened its mouth and began to sing. The sound hit me like a wave, soft at first, then louder and more beautiful than anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't just noise, it was emotion, grief, longing, fear, all wrapped up in a melody that made my chest ache. For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't think. All I wanted was to step into the water and let it take me. Then I felt a sharp pain in my arm, like someone had grabbed me and snapped back to reality. Lydia was there, pulling me away from the edge of the boat. "I told you to stay behind," I shouted over the storm. "I'm not letting you do this alone," she said firmly. Her skin looked worse now, paler, with faint ridges forming along her neck, but her eyes were still clear. She handed me a flare gun and nodded toward the nest. "Do it." I raised the flare gun with trembling hands and aimed at the fuel-soaked water. The creatures started moving closer now, their song growing louder as they surrounded us on all sides. My finger hovered over the trigger as one of them lunged toward Lydia, grabbing her leg and pulling her down. "Gabe!" she screamed. I fired. The flare hit the water and ignited instantly, sending flames roaring across the surface of the nest. The creatures screeched in unison, a sound so loud it made my ears ring, and began thrashing wildly as the fire spread through their breeding ground. Lydia managed to kick free from the creature holding her and scrambled back onto the boat as I gunned the engine and sped away from the burning nest. The modified sound waves kept most of them at bay, but a few tried to follow us through the flooded mangroves. One of them grabbed onto the side of the boat, its webbed hands clawing at Lydia's arm as she fought to push it off. I swung an oar, at its head as hard as I could, knocking it back into the water before it could pull her in. By the time we reached higher ground, we were both soaked and exhausted, but alive. Back at headquarters, Lydia collapsed onto a bench while I checked her over for injuries. Her skin was almost completely translucent now, and faint gill-like structures had started forming along her neck. "I don't have much time," she said quietly. I shook my head, refusing to believe it. "We'll figure something out." But she just smiled sadly and handed me her notebook, the one with all her research on the creatures and their biology. "You need to finish this," she said. "People need to know what's out there." Before I could say anything else, she stood up and walked outside into the rain. I followed her as far as the porch, but stopped when I saw where she was going, toward one of the flooded canals near headquarters. "Lydia!" I shouted after her. She turned back one last time, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Acceptance, maybe. And then she disappeared into the water. The storm finally passed by morning, leaving behind destruction that masked what had really happened out there. Fallen trees, flooded roads, it all looked like hurricane damage to anyone who didn't know better. Government teams arrived later that day under orders to clean up affected areas. They worked quickly and quietly, removing anything that might raise questions, ruins, bodies, even traces of those pearl-like sacks near the nest site. By evening, most of it was gone, as if none of it had ever happened. But I knew better. The park was quiet again. Too quiet. The storm had passed, and the water levels were starting to recede, but everything felt wrong. The mangroves, the cypress, trees, even the air itself. It was like the swamp was holding its breath, waiting for something. The cleanup teams worked quickly, removing anything that might raise questions. They didn't talk much, and I didn't ask. I knew what they were doing, covering it up. The ruins of the research facility were gone by the end of the day, along with any evidence of the creatures or their nest. The official story was simple. Hurricane damage caused flooding and a few unfortunate accidents. No mention of drownings or missing people. No mention of what really happened. I stayed behind after everyone else left. I couldn't bring myself to leave. Not yet. I walked through the park, past the mangrove tunnels and cypress groves, trying to make sense of it all. The water was murky again, hiding whatever was beneath it. But I knew they were still there. The sunken ones. Wells had been right. They weren't gone. They were just waiting. When I got back to my house that night, I felt different. My chest felt tight, and my skin tingled like I'd been in the water too long. I chalked it up to exhaustion at first, too many sleepless nights and too much time spent in the swamp. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I went into the bathroom to splash some water on my face and froze when I looked in the mirror. My eyes, they looked sharper somehow, like they could see things more clearly in the dim light. And my neck. It wasn't obvious yet, but there were faint ridges forming along the sides, almost like gills. I leaned over the sink, gripping the edges so hard my knuckles turned white. No, I whispered to myself, not me. Then I heard it, a faint humming sound coming from somewhere nearby. I turned off the faucet and listened closely. It wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from inside the house. Slowly, I followed the sound to its source, my kitchen sink. The drain was clogged with something pale and slimy, something that pulsed faintly under the light. I reached for a pair of gloves and carefully pulled it out, holding it up to get a better look. It was one of their sacks. I dropped it into a bucket and backed away like it might explode. My breathing was shallow, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Somehow, one of those things had followed me, home, or maybe it had been inside me all along. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. Those black eyes staring at me from beneath still waters, waiting for me to join them. The next morning, I called Wells to tell him what had happened. He didn't sound surprised, not about Lydia or about me. "You've been exposed," he said simply. "It's only a matter of time." I asked him if there was anything I could do to stop it, to fight whatever was happening to me. But he didn't have an answer. "You're lucky," he said, after a long pause. "Most people don't survive this long." Lucky, that's not how it felt. Weeks passed, and life in the park slowly returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after everything that had happened. Tourists came back, unaware of what lurked beneath the surface of those still waters. The drownings stopped, for now, but I knew it wasn't over. Sometimes at night, when everything is quiet and still, I hear them singing again. Soft and distant, but unmistakable. And sometimes when I look in the mirror, I see changes that weren't there before, subtle but undeniable. I don't know how much time I have left before whatever's inside me takes over completely, or if there's even a way to stop it. But one thing is certain. This isn't just about me anymore. The Everglades have secrets, things buried beneath its waters that should have stayed hidden forever, but now they're awake, and they're waiting.